Close your eyes and drift back through time, to an age when Europe was still untamed. And the first echoes of humanity touched the rugged lands of Iberia. Here, in caves like Atapuerca and Orce, 1.2 million years of human history whisper through stone and bone. This peninsula, kissed by the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the blending of peoples, and the forging of one of Europe's oldest identities. Tonight, let the ancient winds of Iberia guide your dreams. Let the story of its people, wild, enduring, and timeless, gently carry you into sleep, as the past comes alive in the quiet rhythm of history. Within the limestone caves of Gran Dolina, archaeologists have uncovered remains of Homo antecessor, a species that lived approximately 800,000 years ago and may represent the common ancestor of both Neanderthals and modern humans. These early inhabitants crafted simple stone tools using local quartzite and flint, demonstrating an understanding of lithic technology that would evolve dramatically over the subsequent millennia. The site of Chima de los Huesos, also within Atapuerca, has yielded the world's largest collection of Middle Pleistocene human fossils, including nearly complete skulls that provide unprecedented insight into human evolution during this critical period. As glacial periods waxed and waned across Europe, Iberia served as a crucial refugium where both human populations and diverse flora and fauna survived the harsh climatic conditions that rendered much of northern Europe uninhabitable. During the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, when ice sheets covered vast portions of the continent, the peninsula's relatively temperate climate allowed Cro-Magnon populations to flourish in caves and rock shelters scattered throughout the Cantabrian Mountains and the Pyrenees. The artistic achievements of these Upper Paleolithic peoples reached their zenith in the painted caves of northern Spain. Altamira, discovered in 1879 near Santillana del Mar, contains some of the finest examples of Paleolithic art in the world. The cave's ceiling transforms into a natural canvas where ancient artists, working by flickering torchlight approximately 15,000 years ago, created vivid depictions of bison, horses and deer using natural ochre pigments and charcoal. The artists demonstrated remarkable skill in utilizing the cave's natural contours to give their animal subjects three-dimensional form, creating an almost sculptural quality that seems to bring the painted beasts to life in the dancing shadows of firelight. The techniques employed at Altamira reveal sophisticated artistic traditions that extended far beyond mere representation. The painters mixed their pigments with animal fat and bone marrow to create durable colors that have survived millennia. They used fingers, primitive brushes made from animal hair, and even blowpipes fashioned from hollow bird bones to achieve different textures and effects. The positioning of the paintings within the cave's deepest recesses suggests these were not mere decorations but held profound spiritual or ritualistic significance for their creators. Similar artistic traditions flourished throughout the Cantabrian region, with painted caves at Tito Bustillo, El Castillo and Las Manitas revealing a shared cultural heritage among Upper Paleolithic populations. These sites collectively demonstrate that Iberian hunter-gatherers possessed complex symbolic thinking and sophisticated social structures capable of supporting specialized artistic production over extended periods. The transition from the Paleolithic to the Neolithic period marked a fundamental transformation in human society across Iberia. Beginning around 7000 BC, agricultural practices began infiltrating the peninsula from the eastern Mediterranean, likely through maritime contacts with early farming communities in the Levant and Anatolia. The fertile alluvial plains of the Guadalquivir, Ebro and Tagus rivers provided ideal conditions for the cultivation of emmer wheat, barley and legumes, while the Mediterranean coastal regions proved suitable for early experiments in animal domestication. Archaeological evidence from sites like La Draga, near Barcelona, reveals that Neolithic communities established permanent settlements along lake shores and riverbanks, constructing substantial wooden structures using sophisticated carpentry techniques. These early farmers developed complex systems of crop rotation and land management that allowed them to support larger, more stable populations than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. Pottery production became widespread during this period, with distinctive cardial ceramics decorated using the serrated edges of cockleshells appearing throughout the Mediterranean littoral. The social implications of agricultural adoption extended far beyond mere subsistence strategies. Neolithic communities developed increasingly complex burial practices, constructing elaborate megalithic monuments that required coordinated labor from multiple family groups or clans. The dolmens of Antequera in Andalusia, built around 3500 BC, represent some of Europe's most architecturally sophisticated prehistoric monuments. The dolmen of Menga, measuring over 25 meters in length and constructed from massive stone slabs weighing up to 180 tons, demonstrates the organizational capabilities and engineering knowledge possessed by these early agricultural societies. Around 2800 BC, a distinctive archaeological culture emerged that would profoundly influence the development of Western European civilization. The bell beaker culture, named for its characteristic inverted bell-shaped pottery vessels, originated in Iberia before spreading throughout Atlantic and Central Europe. These distinctive ceramic vessels, decorated with intricate geometric patterns applied using quart marking and comb techniques, represent more than mere pottery styles. They indicate the emergence of complex trade networks and shared cultural practices across vast geographical distances. Bell beaker communities demonstrated remarkable technological innovation, particularly in metallurgy. Archaeological evidence from sites like Zambujal in Portugal and Los Meleres in Almeria reveals that these societies developed sophisticated copperworking techniques, creating tools, weapons and ornamental objects that far surpassed anything produced during the preceding Neolithic period. The famous Copper Age settlement of Los Meleres, fortified with multiple concentric walls and containing over 100 collective burial sites, illustrates the social stratification and territorial organization characteristic of bell beaker societies. The burial practices associated with bell beaker culture provide fascinating insights into their social organization and belief systems. Unlike the collective burials typical of earlier Neolithic communities, bell beaker societies increasingly practiced individual interment, often accompanied by distinctive grave goods, including their characteristic pottery, copper daggers, stone wrist guards used by archers and gold ornaments. The appearance of these standardized burial assemblages across such vast geographical areas suggests the existence of shared ideological systems and possibly elite networks that transcended local tribal boundaries. Metallurgical innovation accelerated during the early Bronze Age, beginning around 2200 BC. Iberian smiths mastered the complex process of alloying copper with tin to produce bronze, a metal superior to copper in both hardness and durability. The sources of tin required for bronze production were geographically limited, necessitating extensive trade networks that connected Iberian communities with distant regions including Cornwall, Brittany and Central Europe. This metallurgical revolution coincided with significant changes in settlement patterns and social organization. The northwest regions of Iberia witnessed the emergence of a distinctive settlement type known as castros, fortified hilltop communities that would dominate the landscape for over a millennium. These settlements, characterized by their circular stone houses and elaborate defensive systems, first appeared during the Late Bronze Age and reached their zenith during the subsequent Iron Age. Castro culture developed most extensively in modern-day Galicia, northern Portugal and Asturias, where hundreds of these fortified sites have been identified. The Castro of Santa Tecla in Pontevedra exemplifies the architectural sophistication of these communities. Constructed on a prominent hilltop overlooking the Atlantic coast, the settlement contained over 150 circular stone houses arranged in distinct neighborhoods, each surrounded by multiple defensive walls incorporating complex entrance systems, designed to confuse and delay potential attackers. The houses themselves, built using carefully fitted stone blocks without mortar, featured conical thatched roofs and central hearths around which domestic activities centered. Archaeological excavations at Castro sites reveal evidence of specialized craft production, including bronze working, pottery manufacture and textile production. The discovery of bronze casting molds, crucibles and slag at sites like Coana in Asturias demonstrates that these communities supported skilled artisans capable of producing sophisticated metalwork. including weapons, tools and ornamental objects. The standardization of certain artifact types across different Castro sites suggests the existence of shared technological traditions and possibly itinerant craftsmen who moved between communities. Trade networks during the Bronze Age extended far beyond the Iberian Peninsula's boundaries. Archaeological evidence reveals connections with Mediterranean civilizations, Atlantic European communities and even distant regions of Central and Northern Europe. Amber from the Baltic, ivory from North Africa and distinctive pottery styles from various European regions have been discovered at Iberian Bronze Age sites, indicating participation in complex exchange systems that move both raw materials and finished goods across vast distances. The transition to the Iron Age, beginning around 1100 BC, marked another fundamental transformation in Iberian society. The introduction of ironworking technology, initially through contacts with Mediterranean civilizations, revolutionized both warfare and agriculture. Iron tools proved far more efficient than their bronze predecessors for clearing forests, cultivating difficult soils and constructing increasingly elaborate settlements and fortifications. Regional cultural differentiation became increasingly pronounced during the Iron Age. As distinct artistic styles, religious practices and social organizations developed across different areas of the peninsula. The Tartessian culture of southwestern Iberia emerged as one of the most sophisticated of these regional developments, establishing extensive trade connections with Phoenician merchants and developing a distinctive material culture that combined indigenous traditions with Eastern Mediterranean influences. The artistic traditions of Iron Age Iberia reveal sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities and complex symbolic systems. Stone sculptures from sites like Porcuña in Jaén demonstrate mastery of representational art, depicting warriors, animals and mythological creatures with remarkable skill and attention to detail. These sculptures, often associated with elite burials or religious sanctuaries, suggest the emergence of increasingly stratified societies capable of supporting specialized artistic production. Religious practices during the Iron Age became increasingly complex and regionally differentiated. Archaeological evidence from sanctuaries like Concho Ruano in Badajoz reveals elaborate ritual activities involving animal sacrifice, ceremonial feasting and the deposition of valuable objects including jewelry, weapons and imported ceramics. The architectural sophistication of these religious sites, with their carefully planned courtyards, altars and storage facilities, indicates the development of organized priesthoods and institutionalized religious practices. The warrior ideology that would characterize later Iberian societies began emerging during this period, as evidenced by the increasing prominence of weapons in burial assemblages and the appearance of fortified settlements throughout the peninsula. Bronze and iron swords, spears and shields became symbols of status and identity, while the construction of increasingly elaborate defensive systems suggests a landscape characterized by endemic warfare and territorial competition. As the Iron Age matured across the Iberian Peninsula, the southwestern regions witnessed the emergence of one of Europe's most enigmatic and wealthy civilizations, Tartessos, a kingdom that would capture the imagination of ancient historians and modern archaeologists alike. Rose to prominence around 1100 BC in the fertile valleys between the Guadalquivir and Guadiana rivers. This civilization represented a remarkable synthesis of indigenous Iberian traditions and external Mediterranean influences, creating a unique cultural entity that would dominate southwestern Iberia for over 6 centuries. The wealth of Tartessos stemmed primarily from the region's extraordinary mineral resources. The Sierra Morena Mountains contained vast deposits of silver, copper, lead and tin, while the nearby Rio Tinto mines yielded copper ores of exceptional purity. Archaeological evidence from mining sites reveals sophisticated extraction techniques that far surpassed contemporary European standards. Tartessian miners constructed elaborate underground galleries supported by timber frameworks, employed hydraulic systems to separate ores from surrounding rock and developed smelting techniques capable of producing high-grade metals in substantial quantities. The processing of silver became Tartessos' greatest economic asset. Ancient sources describe silver so abundant that Tartessian merchants allegedly crafted anchors, storage vessels and even feeding troughs from the precious metal. While such accounts likely contain elements of exaggeration, archaeological discoveries confirm that silver production reached industrial scales. Excavations at sites like Cerro Solomon have revealed extensive smelting installations with multiple furnaces. Slag heaps containing thousands of tons of waste material and sophisticated ventilation systems that allowed smiths to achieve the high temperatures necessary for efficient metal extraction. The kingdom's strategic location at the mouth of the Guadalquivir River transformed it into a crucial intermediary between Atlantic and Mediterranean trade networks. Tartessian merchants controlled access to the mineral wealth of the interior while simultaneously managing maritime commerce that extended from the British Isles to North Africa. Their vessels, constructed using advanced shipbuilding techniques that incorporated both indigenous and foreign innovations, navigated the treacherous waters beyond the Pillars of Hercules to establish trading relationships with distant Atlantic communities. Tartessian society developed a complex hierarchical structure centered around powerful royal dynasties. Archaeological evidence from elite burial sites reveals a warrior aristocracy that accumulated vast wealth through control of mining operations and trade networks. The tomb goods discovered at sites like La Joya near Huelva include elaborate bronze vessels imported from Central Europe, ivory carvings from North Africa, gold jewelry displaying sophisticated craftsmanship, and iron weapons of exceptional quality. These burial assemblages demonstrate not only the wealth of Tartessian elites but also their extensive international connections. The material culture of Tartessos blended indigenous Iberian traditions with influences from across the Mediterranean world. Pottery production achieved remarkable sophistication, with artisans creating vessels decorated with geometric patterns, animal motifs, and occasionally human figures. The distinctive Tartessian pottery style incorporated techniques learned from Eastern Mediterranean craftsmen while maintaining decorative elements rooted in local Bronze Age traditions. Bronze working reached extraordinary levels of skill, producing cauldrons, mirrors, and ceremonial objects that rank among the finest metalwork of the ancient world. Religious practices in Tartessos combined indigenous Iberian beliefs with deities and rituals borrowed from various Mediterranean cultures. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites reveals the worship of fertility goddesses, solar deities, and protective spirits associated with mining and metal working. Votive offerings discovered at these sites include miniature weapons, jewelry, and animal figurines, suggesting complex ritual practices that sought divine protection for commercial ventures and military endeavors. The arrival of Phoenician merchants around 1100 BC marked a transformative moment in Iberian history. These skilled seafarers from the eastern Mediterranean established trading posts along the southern and eastern coasts, creating permanent settlements that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of indigenous development. The Phoenicians brought with them advanced technologies, sophisticated commercial practices, and most importantly alphabetic writing systems that would eventually be adapted by indigenous populations. Gudea, modern Cadiz, became the most significant Phoenician foundation in Iberia. Established on a strategic island location that provided excellent harbor facilities and defensive advantages, Gudea evolved into the western terminus of Phoenician trade networks that stretched across the entire Mediterranean basin. The settlement's founders selected the site carefully, recognizing its potential to control maritime access to the mineral wealth of Tartessos while providing a secure base for further Atlantic exploration. The urban planning of Gudea reflected sophisticated Phoenician architectural traditions adapted to local conditions. Archaeological excavations have revealed a carefully organized settlement with distinct residential, commercial, and religious quarters. The harbor installations included substantial stone quays, warehouses for storing trade goods, and shipyards capable of constructing and repairing large merchant vessels. The city's defensive system incorporated both natural advantages and artificial fortifications, creating an almost impregnable stronghold that could withstand prolonged sieges. Phoenician merchants introduced revolutionary commercial practices that transformed indigenous economic systems. They established standardized weights and measures, developed complex credit arrangements that facilitated long-distance trade, and created sophisticated accounting systems that tracked transactions across vast geographical distances. These innovations allowed indigenous communities to participate in Mediterranean-wide trade networks for the first time. dramatically expanding their economic horizons and access to foreign goods. The technological transfers initiated by Phoenician contact proved equally transformative. Phoenician craftsmen introduced advanced metallurgical techniques that improved the efficiency of silver and copper production. Pottery-making methods that enhanced both quality and quantity of ceramic production. And textile production technologies that created new opportunities for specialized manufacturing. These technological improvements enabled indigenous communities to produce goods that met Mediterranean market standards, facilitating their integration into broader commercial networks. Perhaps most significantly, the Phoenicians introduced alphabetic writing to Iberian populations. The Phoenician alphabet, adapted from earlier Semitic writing systems, provided a flexible and efficient method for recording information that far surpassed the limitations of purely oral traditions. Indigenous populations gradually modified Phoenician letters to accommodate the phonetic requirements of their own languages, creating distinctive Iberian scripts that would be used for centuries. Greek colonial ventures beginning around 700 BC introduced another layer of Mediterranean influence to Iberian development. Unlike the Phoenicians, who focused primarily on commercial activities, Greek colonists established permanent agricultural settlements that sought to recreate the social and political institutions of their homeland. These colonies became centers of cultural transmission that introduced Greek artistic styles, religious practices, and political concepts to indigenous populations. Emporion, established by colonists from Phocaea around 575 BC, became the most successful Greek settlement in Iberia, located on the Catalonian coast near modern Empúries. The colony occupied a strategic position that allowed control of trade routes connecting the Greek world with indigenous Iberian communities. The settlement's urban layout followed typical Greek colonial patterns, with a central agora surrounded by public buildings, residential quarters organized along geometric street grids, and defensive walls incorporating the latest military engineering techniques. The cultural impact of Emporion extended far beyond its immediate vicinity. Greek merchants and craftsmen established trading relationships with indigenous communities throughout northeastern Iberia, introducing Greek pottery styles, metalworking techniques, and artistic motifs that would be adopted and adapted by local populations. Archaeological evidence from indigenous sites reveals the gradual incorporation of Greek decorative elements into local material culture, creating hybrid artistic styles that reflected the complex cultural interactions occurring throughout the region. Greek religious practices also influenced indigenous spiritual traditions. The Greeks introduced anthropomorphic representations of deities, temple architecture, and ritual practices that differed significantly from indigenous religious traditions. Some native communities adopted Greek deities while maintaining their traditional beliefs, creating syncretic religious systems that combined elements from multiple cultural sources. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites reveals this religious fusion, with Greek-style votive offerings appearing alongside traditional indigenous ritual objects. The establishment of Greek colonies also facilitated the transmission of political concepts that would influence indigenous social development. Greek ideas about citizenship, political participation, and urban organization provided alternative models to traditional tribal structures. While most indigenous communities maintained their traditional political systems, some began experimenting with more centralized forms of government that incorporated elements borrowed from Greek colonial institutions. The development of indigenous writing systems represents one of the most significant cultural achievements of this period. Building upon alphabetic principles learned from Phoenician and Greek contacts, various Iberian populations created distinctive scripts adapted to their specific linguistic requirements. The Northeastern Iberian script, used primarily in modern Catalonia and Valencia, employed a combination of alphabetic and syllabic signs that allowed precise representation of the Iberian language's complex phonetic structure. The Southwestern script, used throughout Tartessian territories, developed somewhat differently, incorporating more syllabic elements and distinctive letter forms that reflected the region's particular cultural influences. Archaeological discoveries have revealed inscriptions on stone monuments, bronze plaques, pottery vessels, and even lead sheets, demonstrating that literacy spread beyond elite circles to include merchants, craftsmen, and possibly even ordinary citizens. These writing systems enabled the recording of legal documents, commercial contracts, religious texts, and administrative records that provided unprecedented insights into indigenous social organization. Inscriptions reveal complex kinship systems, property ownership patterns, religious beliefs, and political structures that had previously been accessible only through archaeological inference. The ability to record information permanently also facilitated more sophisticated administrative systems and commercial practices. Regional chieftains throughout Iberia gradually consolidated their authority during this period, transforming traditional tribal structures into more centralized political entities. These emerging leaders controlled strategic resources, managed trade relationships with Mediterranean merchants, and commanded warrior followings that enabled territorial expansion and political consolidation. Archaeological evidence from elite residential sites reveals increasing social stratification and the concentration of wealth in the hands of powerful families. The transformation of settlement patterns reflected these changing political structures. Traditional hilltop fortifications evolved into more sophisticated urban centers that combined defensive capabilities with commercial and administrative functions. These proto-urban settlements featured specialized craft production areas, organized storage facilities, and public spaces that served both ceremonial and commercial purposes. The increasing size and complexity of these settlements indicate growing population concentrations and more intensive economic activities. Trade relationships between indigenous communities and Mediterranean merchants became increasingly sophisticated and regularized. Indigenous populations learned to produce goods specifically designed for export markets, adapting their traditional crafts to meet foreign preferences and quality standards. This specialization led to increased productivity and technological innovation as communities sought competitive advantages in expanding market networks. The social implications of these economic transformations were profound and far-reaching. Traditional egalitarian tribal structures gave way to more hierarchical societies dominated by wealthy merchant families and warrior elites. Craft specialization created new social categories of skilled artisans whose expertise commanded respect and economic rewards. The accumulation of wealth through trade enabled some individuals and families to achieve unprecedented social prominence and political influence. The consolidation of Mediterranean influences during the preceding centuries had fundamentally transformed Iberian society, creating the conditions for the emergence of distinct indigenous peoples who would dominate the peninsula's political landscape for the next 3 centuries. By 500 BC, 3 major cultural groups had crystallized across the Iberian territories, each developing unique characteristics while maintaining complex relationships with their neighbors and Mediterranean trading partners. The interior regions of the peninsula witnessed the rise of the Celtiberians, a confederation of tribes whose name reflected their mixed Celtic and indigenous Iberian heritage. These peoples occupied the harsh mountainous terrain of the central Meseta, where they developed a distinctive warrior culture that would become legendary throughout the ancient world. Celtiberian society centered around fortified hilltop settlements known as oppida, massive stone constructions that dominated strategic positions throughout the landscape of modern Castile, Aragon and parts of Leon. The oppidum of Numantia, perched on a commanding hilltop overlooking the Duero River Valley, exemplified Celtiberian urban planning and defensive architecture. The settlement's walls, constructed from precisely fitted stone blocks without mortar, rose to heights of over 6 meters and incorporated sophisticated defensive features, including projecting bastions, complex gate systems and carefully planned killing fields that channeled attackers into predetermined zones. Within these formidable defenses, the town contained over 2,000 inhabitants living in rectangular stone houses arranged along carefully planned streets that followed the natural contours of the hilltop. Celtiberian domestic architecture reflected both practical considerations and cultural values. Houses typically measured between 40 and 80 square meters, featuring thick stone walls that provided insulation against the harsh continental climate of the interior plateau. Central hearths served not only for cooking and warmth, but also as focal points for family gatherings and religious observances. Storage areas, often carved directly into the bedrock beneath houses, contained large ceramic vessels for grain, oil and other essential supplies that sustained communities through long winter months. The warrior ethos permeated every aspect of Celtiberian society, shaping social structures, religious practices and artistic expression. Young men underwent rigorous military training that began in childhood and continued throughout their lives. Developing skills in swordsmanship, horsemanship and the use of the distinctive Celtiberian shield known as the citra. This small, round shield, crafted from wood and leather with bronze reinforcements, required exceptional skill to wield effectively, but provided experienced warriors with remarkable mobility and defensive capability. Celtiberian metalworking achieved extraordinary levels of sophistication, particularly in the production of weapons that became renowned throughout the Mediterranean world. Their smiths developed unique steelworking techniques that produced blades of exceptional quality, combining high carbon content with sophisticated tempering methods that created weapons both flexible and durable. The process began with the careful selection of iron ore from local deposits, which was smelted in furnaces capable of achieving temperatures exceeding 1.200 degrees Celsius. The creation of a Celtiberian sword involved multiple stages of heating, folding and hammering that could take several weeks to complete. Smiths alternated layers of high and low carbon steel, creating complex patterns within the metal that not only enhanced the blade's structural integrity, but also produced distinctive wavy patterns that became highly prized decorative elements. The final stages involved careful tempering in water or oil, followed by meticulous sharpening and polishing that created edges capable of cutting through armor and rival weapons with devastating effectiveness. Beyond weapons, Celtiberian craftsmen excelled in the production of jewelry and decorative objects that reflected their sophisticated artistic sensibilities. Bronze torques worn around the neck as symbols of status and identity featured intricate twisted designs and elaborate terminals decorated with animal motifs, geometric patterns and occasionally human faces. These objects required exceptional skill to create, involving techniques of casting, chasing and granulation that demonstrated mastery of complex metallurgical processes. Silver jewelry from Celtiberian workshops incorporated influences from Mediterranean artistic traditions while maintaining distinctively indigenous characteristics. Fibulae, the ornate brooches used to fasten clothing, evolved from simple functional objects into elaborate artistic statements featuring animal forms, mythological creatures and abstract designs that reflected the wearer's social status and tribal affiliations. Archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals that wealthy Celtiberian women wore multiple fibulae simultaneously, creating impressive displays of metalwork that proclaimed their family's prosperity and artistic sophistication. Religious practices among the Celtiberians centered around warrior deities and natural forces that reflected their harsh mountain environment. Archaeological excavations at sanctuary sites have revealed evidence of ritual weapon deposits where warriors offered their finest swords, spears and shields to divine powers in exchange for protection in battle and success in warfare. These deposits, often located in caves or at the sources of rivers, contained hundreds of weapons deliberately broken or bent to prevent their reuse, suggesting complex beliefs about the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds. The western regions of the peninsula were dominated by the Lusitanians, a confederation of tribes whose territories encompassed much of modern Portugal and western Spain. Unlike their Celtiberian neighbors, the Lusitanians developed a predominantly pastoral economy based on cattle herding, sheep raising and seasonal migrations that took advantage of the region's varied topography and climate. This mobile lifestyle created a society that valued independence, personal freedom and resistance to external authority. Lusitanian settlements differed markedly from the massive oppida of the Celtiberians, consisting instead of smaller, more dispersed communities that could be quickly abandoned when circumstances required. These settlements, known as castros, were typically located on hilltops or other defensible positions, but emphasized concealment and mobility over massive fortifications. The circular stone houses within these settlements were constructed using techniques that allowed rapid dismantling and reconstruction, reflecting the semi-nomadic lifestyle of their inhabitants. The pastoral economy of the Lusitanians created social structures that differed significantly from other Iberian peoples. Wealth was measured primarily in livestock rather than land or manufactured goods, leading to the development of complex systems of animal husbandry that maximized productivity while maintaining the mobility essential to Lusitanian culture. Seasonal migrations followed ancient routes that connected winter grazing areas in the lowlands with summer pastures in the mountains, creating a rhythm of movement that shaped every aspect of social organization. Lusitanian warriors developed fighting techniques adapted to their mobile lifestyle and pastoral economy, rather than the heavily armored infantry tactics favored by Celtiberians. Lusitanian military forces emphasized cavalry and light infantry capable of rapid movement across difficult terrain. Their horses, bred for endurance and agility rather than size, could navigate mountain paths and river crossings that would challenge heavier mounts, giving Lusitanian forces significant advantages in their home territories. The weapons favored by Lusitanian warriors reflected their tactical preferences and available resources. Short swords designed for close combat, javelins that could be thrown accurately from horseback, and small shields that provided protection without impeding mobility, formed the core of Lusitanian military equipment. Archaeological evidence suggests that Lusitanian smiths developed distinctive techniques for working iron that produced weapons lighter than those of their neighbors, but equally effective in the hands of skilled warriors. Lusitanian resistance to foreign influence became legendary throughout the ancient world, reflecting deep-seated cultural values that emphasized independence and self-determination. This resistance was not merely military, but encompassed all aspects of cultural interaction with Mediterranean civilizations. While Lusitanians engaged in trade relationships with Phoenician and Greek merchants, they maintained strict control over these interactions, preventing foreign influence from fundamentally altering their traditional way of life. Religious practices among the Lusitanians centered around natural sanctuaries located in remote mountain locations, sacred groves, and springs believed to possess divine power. These sites, often marked only by simple stone altars or carved rock faces, served as focal points for tribal gatherings, religious ceremonies, and the resolution of disputes between different communities. The absence of elaborate temple architecture reflected Lusitanian beliefs about the sacred nature of the natural world and their rejection of foreign religious influences. Archaeological investigations at Lusitanian sanctuary sites have revealed evidence of complex ritual practices involving animal sacrifice, communal feasting, and the deposition of valuable objects including weapons, jewelry, and imported goods. These offerings suggest that religious ceremonies served multiple functions, reinforcing social bonds within communities, demonstrating individual and family status, and maintaining relationships with divine powers believed to control natural forces essential to pastoral success. The eastern and southern coastal regions of the peninsula developed very different characteristics under the direct influence of Mediterranean civilizations. The coastal Iberians, as they became known to ancient historians, created sophisticated urban centers that rivaled contemporary Greek and Phoenician cities in their architectural complexity and commercial importance. These settlements combined indigenous Iberian traditions with Mediterranean urban planning concepts, creating distinctive hybrid cultures that served as intermediaries between interior populations and foreign merchants. The Iberian city of Ullastret, located near the modern Costa Brava, exemplified the architectural sophistication achieved by coastal populations. The settlement occupied a strategic hilltop position that provided commanding views over the surrounding territory, while offering protection from both land and sea-based attacks. Massive stone walls, constructed using techniques learned from Greek colonial architects, enclosed an area of over 13 hectares containing residential quarters, craft production areas, religious precincts, and public spaces designed for commercial and administrative activities. Within Ullastret's walls, urban planning reflected sophisticated understanding of both practical and aesthetic considerations. Streets were laid out in roughly geometric patterns that facilitated movement while creating distinct neighborhoods for different social classes and economic activities. Residential areas contained houses of varying sizes that reflected the social stratification characteristic of urban Iberian society. From modest single-room dwellings for craftsmen and laborers to elaborate multi-room complexes for wealthy merchant families. The largest houses in coastal Iberian cities featured architectural elements borrowed from Mediterranean traditions but adapted to local conditions and preferences. Central courtyards provided light and ventilation while serving as focal points for family activities. Surrounded by rooms dedicated to specific functions including food preparation, storage, sleeping, and the reception of guests. Decorative elements including painted wall plaster, mosaic floors, and carved stone details demonstrated the wealth and cultural sophistication of their owners. Coastal Iberian agricultural techniques achieved remarkable productivity through the application of intensive cultivation methods learned from Mediterranean contacts. Terraced hillsides maximized the use of available land while preventing soil erosion. Supported by sophisticated irrigation systems that channeled water from mountain streams to agricultural plots throughout the coastal plains. These irrigation networks, constructed and maintained through cooperative labor arrangements between different communities, enabled the cultivation of diverse crops including wheat, barley, grapes, olives, and various fruits and vegetables. The agricultural surplus generated by these intensive techniques supported not only growing urban populations but also extensive trade networks that connected coastal Iberian cities with markets throughout the Mediterranean world. Iberian merchants exported agricultural products, manufactured goods, and raw materials while importing luxury items, specialized tools, and exotic goods that enhanced the quality of life for urban elites and demonstrated their connections to broader Mediterranean civilization. Sculpture traditions among coastal Iberians reached extraordinary levels of artistic achievement, producing works that combined indigenous artistic sensibilities with techniques learned from Greek and Phoenician craftsmen. The famous Lady of Elche, discovered near Alicante, represents the pinnacle of Iberian sculptural art, with its sophisticated rendering of human features, elaborate headdress, and complex symbolic elements that reflect the cultural fusion characteristic of coastal Iberian society. Iberian sculptors worked primarily in local limestone, creating both freestanding figures and architectural reliefs that decorated public buildings and religious sanctuaries. Their subjects included representations of deities, portraits of elite individuals, warrior figures, and mythological creatures that reflected the complex belief systems developed through cultural contact with Mediterranean civilizations. The technical skill demonstrated in these works, particularly in the rendering of drapery, facial features, and decorative details, indicates the existence of specialized workshops that trained skilled artisans over extended periods. Religious sculpture served particularly important functions in coastal Iberian society, creating focal points for community identity and spiritual practice. Large-scale figures of deities, often combining indigenous and foreign iconographic elements, were installed in prominent locations within urban centers where they served as symbols of divine protection and community prosperity. Smaller votive sculptures, offered by individuals seeking divine favor or expressing gratitude for answered prayers, have been discovered in large quantities at sanctuary sites throughout the coastal regions. Trade networks connecting coastal Iberian cities with Mediterranean civilizations achieved unprecedented complexity and geographic scope during this period. Iberian merchants established permanent trading relationships with partners in Greece, southern Italy, North Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean, creating commercial networks that moved goods, ideas, and people across vast distances. These relationships went beyond simple exchange, involving credit arrangements, joint ventures, and long-term partnerships that required sophisticated commercial practices and legal frameworks. The port facilities developed by coastal Iberian cities reflected their commercial importance and technical capabilities. Harbor installations included stone quays capable of accommodating large merchant vessels, warehouse complexes for storing trade goods, and specialized facilities for ship construction and repair. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hemeroscopium reveals the existence of shipyards that produced vessels using construction techniques learned from Phoenician and Greek shipwrights, but adapted to local materials and sailing conditions. Coastal Iberian merchants developed distinctive pottery styles that became widely recognized throughout Mediterranean markets. Their ceramics combined functional design with decorative elements that reflected both indigenous artistic traditions and foreign influences. creating products that appealed to diverse consumer preferences. The most sophisticated examples featured complex painted designs incorporating geometric patterns, animal motifs, and occasionally human figures that demonstrated the artistic skill of Iberian craftsmen. The political organization of coastal Iberian cities evolved toward increasingly centralized systems that could manage complex commercial relationships and coordinate the activities of diverse urban populations. Archaeological evidence suggests the emergence of ruling elites who controlled trade networks, managed public works projects, and represented their communities in diplomatic relationships with foreign powers. These leaders accumulated wealth and status through successful commercial ventures while maintaining their authority through the distribution of benefits to their followers and the broader community. Inter-tribal conflicts throughout the peninsula intensified during this period as different groups competed for control of trade routes, agricultural territories, and strategic resources. The Celtiberians, with their formidable military capabilities and strategic position controlling access between the coast and interior, frequently found themselves in conflict with both coastal Iberians seeking to expand their commercial influence and Lusitanians defending their traditional grazing territories. These conflicts were not merely military encounters but complex political struggles that involved shifting alliance systems, diplomatic negotiations, and economic warfare. Archaeological evidence from fortified sites throughout the peninsula reveals increasing investment in defensive capabilities, suggesting that warfare had become a persistent feature of intertribal relationships. The construction of ever more elaborate fortifications required substantial resources and coordinated labor, indicating that communities were willing to make significant sacrifices to maintain their independence and territorial integrity. Alliance systems developed among tribes sharing common interests or facing similar threats, creating larger political entities capable of coordinating military campaigns and commercial activities across extended territories. These alliances were often formalized through marriage relationships between elite families, exchange of hostages, and shared religious ceremonies that created bonds of mutual obligation and support. The gradual political consolidation occurring throughout the peninsula reflected both internal developments and external pressures created by expanding Mediterranean influence. Smaller tribes were absorbed by larger, more successful neighbors through conquest, voluntary association, or gradual cultural assimilation. This process created fewer but more powerful political entities that would play crucial roles in subsequent interactions with Roman forces. The social transformations accompanying political consolidation were profound and far-reaching. Traditional kinship-based social structures gave way to more complex hierarchies based on wealth, military success, and political influence. Specialized roles emerged for warriors, craftsmen, merchants, and religious practitioners, creating social categories that transcended tribal boundaries and facilitated cooperation between different communities. Economic specialization increased dramatically as communities focused on producing goods for which they possessed particular advantages in terms of raw materials, technical expertise, or geographic location. This specialization created interdependencies that encouraged peaceful relationships while simultaneously generating conflicts over access to essential resources and markets. The established political landscape of Iberia faced its greatest challenge when Carthaginian forces under Hamilcar Barca landed near Gadir in 237 BC, initiating a period of foreign domination that would fundamentally transform the peninsula. The Carthaginians, seeking compensation for territories lost during the First Punic War, recognized Iberia's strategic value not merely as a source of wealth but as a launching point for their renewed conflict with Rome. The silver mines of the Sierra Morena, which had enriched Tartessian kingdoms centuries earlier, now became the foundation for Carthaginian military expansion and the eventual theater for one of history's most decisive conflicts. Hamilcar Barca's initial campaigns demonstrated the sophisticated military engineering capabilities that Carthaginian forces brought to Iberian warfare. Rather than relying solely on coastal strongholds, the Carthaginians established a network of inland fortifications that controlled key river valleys and mountain passes. The fortress of Cart Hadasht, modern Cartagena, became the centerpiece of this strategic system. Built on a naturally defensible peninsula with multiple harbors, The city featured massive stone walls incorporating the latest Mediterranean siege defense techniques, including projecting towers, complex gate systems, and carefully planned fields of fire that could devastate attacking forces. The urban planning of Kurt Hadasht reflected Carthaginian administrative sophistication and their understanding of colonial management. The city contained distinct quarters for military personnel, civilian administrators, local Iberian allies, and foreign merchants, each with appropriate facilities and defensive capabilities. Extensive warehouse complexes near the harbors stored not only trade goods but also military supplies, including weapons, armor, siege equipment, and provisions necessary to support large armies operating far from their bases. Carthaginian recruitment strategies transformed traditional Iberian military practices while exploiting existing tribal rivalries and warrior traditions. Rather than imposing foreign military structures, Carthaginian commanders adapted their forces to incorporate indigenous fighting techniques and weapons while providing superior equipment and training. Celtiberian warriors, renowned for their exceptional swordsmanship and fierce independence, found service with Carthaginian forces offered opportunities for wealth and glory that exceeded what their traditional societies could provide. The integration of Iberian cavalry units proved particularly valuable to Carthaginian military operations. Lusitanian horsemen, with their intimate knowledge of local terrain and exceptional riding skills, became elite reconnaissance forces capable of conducting deep penetration raids against enemy territories. These mounted units operated with independence that would have been impossible within traditional Roman military structures. Using their mobility to gather intelligence, disrupt enemy communications, and strike at vulnerable targets before disappearing into familiar landscape. Iberian infantry formations adapted Carthaginian equipment while maintaining their traditional tactical flexibility. The distinctive Celtiberian shield, the citra, proved ideally suited to the fluid combat situations that characterized warfare in the peninsula's mountainous terrain. Carthaginian armorers provided improved weapons, including longer swords, reinforced spear points, and better protective equipment, but allowed indigenous units to retain their traditional fighting styles and unit organization. The economic transformation accompanying Carthaginian occupation exceeded even the changes brought by earlier Phoenician contact. Mining operations expanded dramatically under Carthaginian management, employing thousands of workers in extraction and processing activities that supplied silver for military expenditures throughout the Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from mining sites revealed sophisticated techniques including hydraulic systems for ore separation, improved smelting furnaces capable of higher temperatures, and transportation networks that moved raw materials and finished products across vast distances. Agricultural production intensified to support growing military and civilian populations concentrated around Carthaginian strongholds. Traditional Iberian farming techniques were supplemented with methods developed in North Africa, including improved irrigation systems, crop rotation practices, and the cultivation of new plant varieties adapted to Mediterranean conditions. These agricultural improvements enabled the peninsula to support population levels that would have been impossible under traditional subsistence systems. The arrival of Hannibal in 221 BC marked the beginning of the most dramatic phase of Carthaginian expansion in Iberia. Unlike his predecessors, who had focused primarily on consolidating coastal territories and establishing tribute relationships with interior tribes, Hannibal pursued aggressive campaigns aimed at complete territorial control. His siege of Saguntum in 219 BC demonstrated both Carthaginian military capabilities and their strategic understanding of Roman vulnerabilities. Saguntum occupied a formidable defensive position on a rocky outcrop that commanded the coastal plains south of the Ebro River. The city's walls, constructed using massive stone blocks fitted without mortar, rose directly from precipitous cliffs that made direct assault extremely difficult. Hannibal's forces employed sophisticated siege techniques, including the construction of assault ramps, the deployment of torsion artillery, and the systematic undermining of wall sections through tunneling operations that required exceptional engineering skills. The 8-month siege revealed the determination and resources that Carthaginian forces could bring to bear against determined resistance. Hannibal's engineers constructed elaborate siege works, including wooden towers that matched the height of Saguntum's walls, catapults capable of hurling stones weighing over 60 kilograms, and covered approaches that protected assault troops from defensive fire. The systematic nature of these operations demonstrated that Carthaginian forces possessed not only individual courage, but also the organizational capabilities necessary for complex military undertakings. The fall of Saguntum precipitated the Second Punic War and transformed Iberia into the primary theater for the conflict between Rome and Carthage. Roman forces under Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio landed near Emporion in 218 BC, beginning a military campaign that would continue for nearly 2 decades and fundamentally alter the political landscape of the peninsula. The Romans brought military techniques and organizational systems that differed dramatically from both indigenous Iberian and Carthaginian approaches to warfare. Roman military engineering capabilities became immediately apparent in their construction of fortified camps that provided secure bases for operations in hostile territory. These camps, built according to standardized patterns that could be rapidly implemented by trained legionaries, featured earthwork defenses, wooden palisades, and internal layouts that maximized defensive effectiveness while providing adequate space for troops, equipment, and supplies. Archaeological excavations at sites like Tarraco reveal the sophistication of Roman military architecture and their understanding of logistical requirements for extended campaigns. The Roman manipular system, with its emphasis on disciplined formations and coordinated tactics, initially struggled against the fluid combat styles employed by Iberian warriors. Celtiberian and Lusitanian forces excelled at exploiting terrain advantages, conducting ambush attacks, and avoiding the direct confrontations that favored Roman tactical superiority. Early Roman defeats at battles like Sissa in 218 BC demonstrated the challenges faced by traditional Mediterranean military systems when confronted with indigenous Iberian warfare. Roman adaptation to Iberian conditions required significant modifications to their traditional military practices. Auxiliary units recruited from allied tribes provided essential capabilities including mounted reconnaissance, specialized infantry techniques, and intimate knowledge of local terrain and weather conditions. These auxiliary forces operated with greater independence than traditional Roman military units, conducting long-range patrols, gathering intelligence, and engaging in the type of irregular warfare that characterized much of the Iberian conflict. The strategic importance of Iberian silver mines became increasingly apparent as both sides recognized that control of these resources would determine their ability to sustain military operations. Roman forces systematically targeted Carthaginian mining operations, not merely to deny resources to their enemies, but to secure the wealth necessary for their own expanding military commitments. The capture of mining centers required specialized techniques including the construction of siege works in mountainous terrain, and the development of supply lines capable of supporting operations far from coastal bases. Carthaginian responses to Roman pressure revealed both the strengths and limitations of their position in Iberia. While they possessed superior naval capabilities that enabled rapid movement of troops and supplies between different theaters, their reliance on indigenous allies created vulnerabilities that Roman diplomacy could exploit. The defection of tribal leaders who had initially supported Carthaginian forces reflected the complex political calculations that indigenous populations made when confronted with competing foreign powers. The Battle of Bicula in 208 BC demonstrated the evolution of Roman tactical capabilities under the pressure of Iberian warfare. Scipio Africanus, commanding Roman forces, employed a combination of traditional legionary formations and innovative tactics adapted to local conditions. His use of Iberian auxiliary units to outflank Carthaginian positions, while maintaining the disciplined advance of Roman heavy infantry, created a tactical synthesis that proved devastatingly effective against enemies who had previously dominated battlefield encounters. Roman victory at Bicula marked the beginning of systematic Carthaginian withdrawal from Iberian territories. But the conflict's conclusion did not bring immediate peace to the peninsula. Indigenous populations, having experienced 2 decades of intensive warfare and foreign occupation, faced the challenge of adapting to Roman administrative systems that differed fundamentally from both their traditional political structures and Carthaginian colonial practices. The Roman approach to territorial administration emphasized the establishment of permanent settlements that could serve as centers of Roman influence while providing security for ongoing military operations. These settlements, initially military colonies populated by veteran legionaries, gradually evolved into urban centers that attracted indigenous populations, seeking the economic opportunities and security that Roman administration provided. The transformation of military camps into permanent cities represented a fundamental shift from the temporary occupation strategies employed by earlier Mediterranean civilizations. Roman legal systems introduced concepts of property ownership, commercial regulation and dispute resolution that conflicted with traditional Iberian customs based on kinship relationships and tribal authority. The gradual implementation of Roman law required careful negotiation with indigenous leaders who retained significant influence over their followers and could either facilitate or obstruct Roman administrative objectives. Archaeological evidence from urban sites reveals the slow adaptation of Roman architectural styles and urban planning concepts by indigenous populations who maintained many of their traditional cultural practices. The economic integration of Iberian territories into Roman commercial networks created opportunities for unprecedented prosperity while simultaneously undermining traditional subsistence systems. Indigenous communities that successfully adapted to Roman commercial practices could accumulate wealth through specialized production of goods for export markets. But those unable to compete with Roman efficiency and organization found themselves marginalized and impoverished. Mining operations under Roman management achieved industrial scales that exceeded even Carthaginian production levels. Roman engineers introduced advanced techniques including the use of water wheels for ore processing, improved ventilation systems for underground workings and sophisticated transportation networks that connected mining sites with processing facilities and shipping ports. These technological improvements enabled the extraction of mineral wealth on scales that transformed the peninsula's economic significance within the broader Roman world. Agricultural transformation accompanied mining expansion as Roman settlers and indigenous populations collaborated to develop intensive cultivation systems capable of supporting growing urban populations. The introduction of new crops, improved farming tools and systematic land management practices increased agricultural productivity while creating surplus production that could be exported to other Roman territories. These changes fundamentally altered the relationship between human populations and the natural environment throughout much of the peninsula. The resistance that would define the next phase of Roman conquest began emerging even during the final stages of the Punic Wars. Indigenous leaders who had initially collaborated with Roman forces against Carthaginian occupation began recognizing that Roman administration posed different but equally serious threats to their traditional authority and cultural independence. The systematic nature of Roman territorial organization, with its emphasis on permanent settlements and legal integration, offered fewer opportunities for maintaining traditional political structures than had been possible under Carthaginian rule. The completion of Augustus's Cantabrian and Asturian campaigns in 19 BC marked the definitive end of indigenous resistance and the beginning of Hispania's transformation into one of Rome's most prosperous and culturally significant provinces. The emperor's personal involvement in these final campaigns demonstrated the strategic importance Rome placed on securing complete control over the peninsula's mineral wealth and establishing secure northern frontiers that would protect the increasingly valuable territories to the south. The initial administrative framework established by Augustus divided Hispania into 3 distinct provinces, each designed to address specific geographic, economic and strategic considerations. Hispania Sateria, later renamed Terra Cunensis after its capital at Tarraco, encompassed the vast northern and eastern territories from the Pyrenees to the Atlantic coast. This enormous province, covering nearly 2/3 of the peninsula, reflected both the recent conquest of northern territories and the need for centralized military command to prevent future rebellions among the recently subdued mountain tribes. Hispania Ulteria was subdivided into 2 more manageable administrative units that recognized the distinct characteristics of the peninsula's southern and western regions. Baetica, with its capital at Corduba, controlled the wealthy Guadalquivir Valley and surrounding territories that had experienced the longest period of Mediterranean influence. The province's boundaries encompassed the former Tartessian heartland, areas that had been thoroughly integrated into Roman commercial networks during the previous 2 centuries of conquest and colonization. Lusitania, centered on the newly founded city of Emerita Augusta, governed the western territories that had been the homeland of the fierce Lusitanian tribes. The establishment of this separate province recognized both the cultural characteristics of the region's inhabitants and the strategic importance of controlling the Atlantic coastal approaches to the peninsula. The choice of Emerita Augusta as the provincial capital demonstrated Roman confidence in their ability to transform former centers of resistance into loyal administrative centers. Each province received a carefully designed administrative structure that balanced Roman efficiency with accommodation of local conditions and traditions. Provincial governors, appointed directly by the emperor or the Senate depending on the province's strategic importance, wielded extensive military and civilian authority but operated within legal frameworks that protected both Roman citizens and indigenous populations who had received various forms of legal recognition. The gradual extension of Roman citizenship to deserving individuals and communities provided powerful incentives for cooperation while creating local elites with vested interests in Roman success. The urban transformation of Hispania began immediately following the of provincial administration as Roman engineers and architects implemented ambitious construction projects designed to demonstrate imperial power while providing the infrastructure necessary for effective governance. Tarraco, elevated to the status of provincial capital, received massive investments in public architecture that transformed the modest coastal settlement into a magnificent urban center worthy of its administrative importance. The construction of Tarraco's provincial forum required the leveling of an entire hillside and the creation of artificial terraces supported by massive retaining walls that rose over 20 meters above the natural ground level. This enormous engineering project, completed over several decades, created a monumental complex that included temples dedicated to the imperial cult, basilicas for legal proceedings and administrative buildings that housed the provincial government's extensive bureaucracy. The forum's design incorporated architectural elements from throughout the Roman world while adapting to the specific topographic challenges presented by the coastal location. The amphitheater constructed at Tarraco demonstrated the Romans' understanding of public entertainment as a tool for cultural integration and political control. Built into a natural depression overlooking the Mediterranean, the structure could accommodate over 14,000 spectators who gathered to witness gladiatorial contests, wild animal hunts and public executions that reinforced Roman concepts of justice and social hierarchy. The amphitheater's sophisticated design included underground chambers for storing animals and equipment, complex drainage systems that prevented flooding during heavy rains, and carefully planned entrances that could handle large crowds without dangerous congestion. Aqueduct construction throughout Hispania represented perhaps the most impressive demonstration of Roman engineering capabilities and their commitment to urban development. The aqueduct system serving Tarraco stretched over 25 kilometers from mountain springs to the city, incorporating bridges that spanned deep valleys, tunnels carved through solid rock, and distribution networks that supplied water to public fountains, private houses and industrial facilities throughout the urban area. The precision required for these constructions demanded surveying techniques that maintained consistent gradients over vast distances while navigating complex topographic obstacles. The engineering challenges faced by Roman aqueduct builders in Hispania exceeded those encountered in many other provinces due to the peninsula's mountainous terrain and extreme seasonal variations in water availability. The aqueduct serving Segovia, with its iconic two-tiered bridge spanning the valley that separates the old city from surrounding hills, required the transportation and precise placement of granite blocks weighing several tons each. The structure's 167 arches, built without mortar using only the precise fitting of carefully shaped stones, have survived nearly 2 millennia of weathering and seismic activity. Road construction proceeded simultaneously with urban development, creating transportation networks that connected every significant settlement with provincial capitals and ultimately with Rome itself. The Via Augusta, extending from the Pyrenees to Gardens, became the peninsula's primary arterial route, facilitating the rapid movement of troops, officials and commercial goods across the entire length of Hispania's Mediterranean coast. The road's construction required bridging major rivers, cutting through mountain passes and creating stable foundations across varied terrain that included coastal plains, river valleys and highland plateaus. Roman road engineering in Hispania demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both construction techniques and maintenance requirements. The typical Roman road consisted of multiple layers, including a foundation of large stones, intermediate layers of smaller stones and gravel, and a surface of carefully fitted paving stones that provided smooth, durable travel surfaces capable of supporting heavy traffic in all weather conditions. Drainage systems prevented water damage, while milestone markers provided distance information and identified the officials responsible for construction and maintenance. The economic transformation accompanying Roman administrative consolidation exceeded even the changes brought by earlier Carthaginian occupation. Mining operations expanded to industrial scales that supplied significant portions of the empire's precious metal requirements, while agricultural development created surplus production that fed populations throughout the Mediterranean world. The systematic exploitation of Hispania's natural resources required technological innovations, organizational capabilities and capital investments that fundamentally altered the relationship between human activity and the natural environment. Silver mining in the Sierra Morena reached unprecedented levels of production under Roman management, employing tens of thousands of workers in extraction and processing operations that operated continuously throughout the year. Roman engineers introduced hydraulic techniques that used water pressure to break apart ore-bearing rock formations, creating artificial reservoirs and distribution channels that could direct water flows with sufficient force to excavate entire hillsides. These operations, known as ruina montium, transformed vast areas of the landscape while producing silver in quantities that influenced monetary systems throughout the Roman world. The Riotinto copper mines, already ancient when the Romans arrived, were expanded and modernized using techniques that increased both the quantity and quality of metal production. Roman engineers constructed extensive underground galleries that followed ore veins deep into the earth, supported by timber frameworks and ventilated by carefully planned shaft systems that provided fresh air to workers operating far below ground level. The scale of these operations required the construction of entire settlements to house workers, administrative personnel and support services necessary for sustained industrial activity. Lead mining operations in the Cartagena region supplied raw materials for the extensive plumbing systems that served Roman cities throughout Hispania and beyond. The extraction and processing of lead ore required different techniques than those used for precious metals, including specialized furnaces capable of achieving the temperatures necessary for efficient smelting and purification. Roman engineers developed standardized production methods that created lead pipes, sheets and other products meeting consistent quality standards that facilitated their use in construction projects across the empire. Agricultural transformation proceeded through the systematic implementation of intensive cultivation techniques that maximize productivity while creating surplus production for export markets. The latifundia system, employing large numbers of slave laborers on extensive estates owned by wealthy Roman citizens, replaced traditional subsistence farming throughout much of southern and central Hispania. These agricultural enterprises specialized in crops that commanded high prices in Roman markets, including wheat, olive oil, wine and garum, the fermented fish sauce that became a staple of Roman cuisine. Olive cultivation expanded dramatically under Roman management, transforming hillsides throughout Baetica into terraced groves that produced oil of exceptional quality. Roman agricultural techniques included careful selection of olive varieties adapted to local soil and climate conditions, sophisticated pruning and fertilization methods that maximized fruit production, and processing techniques that created different grades of oil for various uses including cooking, lighting and religious ceremonies. The standardization of production methods and quality control systems enabled Hispanian olive oil to compete successfully in markets throughout the Mediterranean world. Wine production similarly benefited from Roman agricultural expertise and commercial organization. The introduction of new grape varieties, Improved cultivation techniques and systematic aging processes created wines that became highly prized in Rome and other major urban centers. Archaeological evidence from villa sites throughout Hispania reveals extensive facilities for wine production, including fermentation chambers, storage areas, and transportation systems that could handle large-scale commercial production, while maintaining quality standards necessary for export markets. The integration of Hispania into Mediterranean trade networks created commercial opportunities that transformed the peninsula's economic structure and social organization. Indigenous communities that successfully adapted to Roman commercial practices accumulated unprecedented wealth, while those unable to compete found themselves marginalized within the new economic system. The development of specialized production centers, each focusing on goods for which they possessed particular advantages, created interdependencies that encouraged peaceful relationships, while generating conflicts over access to essential resources and markets. Pottery production centers throughout Hispania developed distinctive styles that combined Roman functional requirements with indigenous artistic traditions. The Terra Sigillata workshops of northern Hispania produced high-quality ceramic vessels that were exported throughout the Western Roman Empire, competing successfully with products from Gaul and Italy. These workshops employed hundreds of skilled craftsmen who created standardized products using molds and firing techniques that ensured consistent quality and appearance. Textile production expanded significantly under Roman rule, taking advantage of the peninsula's abundant wool supplies and the growing demand for high-quality fabrics in urban markets. Roman techniques for processing wool, including improved methods for cleaning, dyeing, and weaving, created products that commanded premium prices while providing employment for thousands of workers in both urban workshops and rural processing centers. The standardization of weights, measures, and quality standards facilitated trade relationships that extended throughout the Roman world. The emergence of Hispano-Roman elites represented one of the most significant social developments of the early imperial period. Wealthy indigenous families who had successfully adapted to Roman administrative and commercial systems began accumulating political influence that extended far beyond their provincial origins. These families invested their wealth in education, urban properties, and political connections that enabled their sons to pursue careers in Roman government and military service. The educational system that developed in Hispanian cities attracted students from throughout the Western Mediterranean, creating intellectual centers that contributed significantly to Roman literature, philosophy, and legal scholarship. Rhetoric schools in cities like Corduba and Tarraco trained young men in the oratorical skills necessary for successful political careers, while libraries and scholarly associations provided environments where intellectual activity could flourish under imperial patronage. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, born in the Roman colony of Italica near Hispalis, exemplified the opportunities available to ambitious Hispano-Romans who successfully navigated the complex requirements of imperial service. His military career, beginning with service in Germanic frontier regions, demonstrated the competence and loyalty that enabled provincial elites to achieve positions of responsibility within the imperial administration. His appointment as governor of Upper Germania reflected imperial confidence in his administrative abilities and military judgment. Trajan's elevation to imperial power in 98 AD marked a watershed moment in the relationship between Rome and its provincial territories. For the first time, the empire was ruled by someone born outside Italy, demonstrating that merit and achievement could transcend geographic origins within the Roman system. His reign, characterized by extensive military conquests and ambitious building projects, reflected both his personal capabilities and the wealth that flowed from Hispanian provinces to support imperial ambitions. The architectural projects undertaken during Trajan's reign transformed Rome itself while providing models for urban development throughout the provinces. Trajan's Forum, with its innovative design incorporating markets, administrative buildings, and commemorative monuments, demonstrated architectural concepts that were subsequently adapted for use in provincial cities. The techniques developed for these Roman projects, including the use of concrete construction and sophisticated engineering methods, were transmitted to Hispanian architects and engineers who implemented similar projects in their home territories. Hadrian's succession to imperial power in 117 AD continued the Hispano-Roman influence on imperial policy, while demonstrating the cultural sophistication that provincial elites could achieve. Born in Italica like his predecessor, Hadrian received an education that combined traditional Roman learning with Greek philosophical traditions and provincial cultural influences. His intellectual curiosity and artistic sensibilities reflected the cosmopolitan environment that characterized the most successful Hispano-Roman families. Hadrian's travels throughout the empire, including extensive visits to Hispanian provinces, demonstrated imperial commitment to provincial development while providing opportunities for local elites to display their loyalty and competence. The construction projects initiated during these visits, including temples, theaters and infrastructure improvements, created employment opportunities while demonstrating imperial favor toward communities that had successfully integrated into the Roman system. The cultural synthesis that developed in Hispania during the early imperial period created distinctive regional characteristics that combined Roman institutional frameworks with indigenous traditions and Mediterranean influences. Religious practices evolved to incorporate Roman deities within existing sacred landscapes, creating syncretic belief systems that satisfied both imperial requirements and local spiritual needs. Archaeological evidence from sanctuary sites reveals the gradual transformation of indigenous religious practices rather than their complete replacement by Roman alternatives. Urban planning in Hispanian cities reflected this cultural synthesis through the adaptation of Roman architectural concepts to local conditions and preferences. The forum complexes constructed in provincial capitals incorporated design elements from throughout the Mediterranean world while accommodating regional variations in climate, available materials and cultural practices. These adaptations created architectural styles that were recognizably Roman while maintaining distinctive regional characteristics that reflected local traditions and preferences. The Latin language gradually replaced indigenous languages throughout most of Hispania, but this linguistic transformation occurred through gradual adoption rather than forced imposition. Bilingual inscriptions from the early imperial period reveal the coexistence of Latin with indigenous languages during transitional phases, while the eventual predominance of Latin reflected its practical advantages for commercial, legal and administrative activities rather than systematic suppression of local linguistic traditions. The religious landscape of Hispania underwent a profound transformation during the early centuries of the Common Era, as a new faith from the eastern Mediterranean gradually penetrated the established Roman provincial society. Christianity's arrival in the peninsula occurred through the same commercial and administrative networks that had facilitated earlier cultural exchanges. But its impact would prove far more revolutionary than any previous religious innovation. Unlike the syncretic adaptations that had characterized earlier religious changes, Christianity demanded exclusive devotion and rejected the polytheistic traditions that had defined Mediterranean spirituality for millennia. The earliest Christian communities in Hispania emerged in the major urban centers along the Mediterranean coast, where Greek and Syrian merchants had established trading networks that maintained regular contact with the eastern provinces where the new religion had first taken root. Archaeological evidence from Taroko suggests the presence of Christian communities by the mid-2nd century, based on distinctive burial practices and symbolic decorations that differed markedly from traditional Roman funerary customs. These early Christians buried their dead in separate cemeteries located outside city walls, avoiding cremation practices that conflicted with their beliefs about bodily resurrection. The catacombs discovered beneath Taroko reveal sophisticated underground burial complexes that served both practical and spiritual functions for growing Christian communities. These subterranean galleries, carved directly into the soft limestone bedrock, contained hundreds of burial niches arranged in multiple levels that maximized the use of available space while providing appropriate settings for memorial services and religious gatherings. The walls featured painted decorations incorporating Christian symbols including fish, anchors and doves that conveyed religious meanings while avoiding the overtly Christian imagery that might attract unwanted attention from Roman authorities. Christian communities in Córdoba developed somewhat differently, reflecting the distinct social and economic characteristics of Baetica's capital city. The presence of wealthy Jewish communities in Corduba provided a foundation for Christian missionary activity as the new religion's monotheistic theology and scriptural traditions resonated with populations already familiar with non-polytheistic religious concepts. Archaeological discoveries in the city's ancient quarters have revealed house churches dating to the 3rd century. Modest residential buildings that were modified to accommodate religious gatherings while maintaining their domestic appearance to avoid attracting official notice. The house church excavated beneath the modern Cathedral of Corduba demonstrates the architectural adaptations that early Christian communities made to existing urban structures. The building's central courtyard was enlarged to accommodate larger gatherings while interior walls were removed to create a single large space suitable for communal worship. A raised platform at one end provided space for religious leaders to address assembled congregations while adjacent rooms served as storage areas for religious texts, ceremonial objects, and charitable supplies distributed to community members in need. Christian communities throughout Hispania faced periodic persecution from Roman authorities who viewed the new religion's exclusive claims and rejection of traditional civic religious obligations as threats to social order and political stability. The persecution initiated by Emperor Decius in 250 AD targeted Christian leadership throughout the empire, demanding that all citizens demonstrate their loyalty by participating in public sacrifices to traditional Roman deities. Many Hispanian Christians complied with these requirements either through genuine conversion or pragmatic accommodation. But others chose martyrdom rather than compromise their religious convictions. The martyrdom of Saint Fructuosus, Bishop of Tarraco, along with his deacons Augurius and Eulogius in 259 AD became a foundational event in Hispanian Christian memory and identity. Roman authorities arrested the 3 men during the persecution ordered by Emperor Valerian, charging them with refusing to sacrifice to the Roman gods and undermining public order through their religious activities. Contemporary accounts describe their trial before the provincial governor, where they maintained their Christian faith despite threats of torture and death. The execution took place in Tarraco's amphitheater, the same venue where gladiatorial contests and wild animal hunts had entertained Roman audiences for generations. The choice of this location was deliberate, intended to demonstrate the consequences of defying imperial religious policies while providing a public spectacle that would discourage others from following the martyr's example. Instead, the dignified behavior of the 3 men during their execution impressed many spectators and contributed to growing sympathy for Christian beliefs among the urban population. Saint Eulalia of Emerita became another significant figure in early Hispanian Christian martyrology, representing the particular courage of young women who chose death rather than renounce their faith. According to contemporary accounts, Eulalia was a 12-year-old girl from a wealthy Roman family who publicly denounced the persecution of Christians and declared her own Christian beliefs before the provincial governor. Her youth and social status made her defiance particularly shocking to Roman authorities, who initially attempted to persuade her to recant through appeals to her family's position and her own promising future. When persuasion failed, Roman authorities subjected Eulalia to increasingly severe tortures designed to break her resolve and provide an example to other potential Christian converts. The accounts describe her enduring various torments including burning, laceration and exposure, maintaining her Christian testimony throughout these ordeals, while reportedly experiencing miraculous interventions that demonstrated divine protection. Her eventual death transformed her into a powerful symbol of Christian resistance and divine favor that inspired subsequent generations of Hispanian believers. Saint Vincent of Zaragoza suffered martyrdom during the same persecution, becoming one of the most widely venerated saints throughout the Western Roman Empire. Vincent served as a deacon under Bishop Valerius of Zaragoza, assisting in the administration of Christian communities throughout the Ebro Valley region. When Roman authorities arrested both men during the systematic persecution of Christian leadership, Vincent's eloquence and theological knowledge made him a target for official attempts to demonstrate the intellectual weakness of Christian beliefs. The tortures inflicted upon Vincent, as described in contemporary martyrological accounts, exceeded even the brutal standards typical of Roman persecution. Authorities employed heated metal plates, sharp hooks that tore flesh from bones and salt rubbed into open wounds to maximize his suffering. while providing opportunities for him to renounce his faith and save his life. Vincent's steadfast refusal to compromise his beliefs, combined with reports of miraculous events surrounding his torture and death, created a powerful martyrological narrative that spread throughout Christian communities across the empire. The cult of Saint Vincent developed rapidly following his martyrdom, with churches dedicated to his memory appearing in cities throughout Hispania, Gaul and North Africa. The saint's popularity reflected both the compelling nature of his martyrological story and the practical needs of Christian communities seeking powerful intercessors who could provide protection and assistance in times of crisis. Archaeological evidence from church sites throughout Hispania reveals the widespread veneration of Vincent through inscriptions, artistic representations and architectural dedications that continued for centuries after his death. The establishment of episcopal sees in major Hispanian cities occurred gradually during the 3rd and early 4th centuries. As Christian communities grew large enough to require formal ecclesiastical organization and gain sufficient social acceptance to operate openly. The Bishop of Corduba appears in historical records by 300 AD, indicating the presence of a well-established Christian community capable of supporting full-time religious leadership. Similar episcopal positions were created in Tarraco, Emerita Augusta, Hispalis and other major urban centers as Christian populations reached critical mass and developed the organizational structures necessary for effective religious administration. The Council of Elvira, convened around 305 AD near Granada, represented the first major ecclesiastical assembly in Hispanian Christian history and demonstrated the growing confidence and organizational sophistication of the peninsula's Christian communities. The council brought together bishops from throughout Hispania to address pressing questions about Christian behavior, church discipline and the relationship between Christian communities and the broader Roman society in which they existed. The detailed canons produced by this assembly provide invaluable insights into the practical challenges faced by early Christian communities and the solutions developed by their religious leadership. The council's deliberations addressed numerous issues that reflected the complex social situation of Christians living within Roman society while maintaining religious beliefs that often conflicted with traditional practices. Questions about marriage between Christians and pagans, participation in public festivals that included religious elements and the appropriate response to persecution dominated the discussions. The bishops sought to establish clear guidelines that would maintain Christian theological integrity while enabling believers to function effectively within Roman social and economic systems. The canons regarding clerical celibacy adopted at Elvira represented one of the most significant decisions emerging from the council, establishing requirements that would influence Christian practice throughout the Western Church for centuries. The bishops decreed that married men who became bishops, priests or deacons must abstain from sexual relations with their wives, effectively requiring celibacy from all higher-ranking clergy. This decision reflected both theological convictions about the spiritual benefits of celibacy and practical concerns about preventing the development of hereditary clerical dynasties that might undermine church authority. Marriage regulations addressed by the council revealed the complex social negotiations required as Christian communities grew and interacted more extensively with non-Christian populations. The bishops prohibited marriages between Christian women and pagan men, reflecting concerns about the religious education of children and the maintenance of Christian household practices. However, they permitted Christian men to marry pagan women under certain circumstances, demonstrating a pragmatic recognition of social realities while maintaining theological principles about the importance of Christian family structures. The council's decisions regarding economic activities reflected the practical challenges faced by Christians who needed to earn livings within Roman commercial systems that often involved religious elements. The bishops prohibited Christians from participating in certain trades, including the manufacture of idols, the operation of businesses that catered primarily to pagan religious festivals, and occupations that required regular participation in non-Christian religious ceremonies. These restrictions created economic hardships for some Christian families but were necessary to maintain the religious integrity of the community. Distinctive Hispano-Christian practices began emerging during the 4th century as local churches developed traditions that reflected both universal Christian teachings and regional cultural characteristics. The veneration of martyrs became particularly elaborate in Hispanian churches, with elaborate liturgical celebrations, architectural monuments, and artistic representations that exceeded similar practices in other provinces. This emphasis on martyrdom reflected both the historical experience of persecution in Hispania and cultural values that honored courage and sacrifice in the face of adversity. The development of Christian architecture in Hispania incorporated elements from Roman building traditions while adapting to the specific requirements of Christian worship. Early church buildings often utilized modified Roman basilica designs that provided appropriate spaces for congregational gatherings, baptismal ceremonies, and the celebration of the Eucharist. However, Hispanian architects developed distinctive decorative elements and spatial arrangements that reflected local artistic traditions and the particular devotional practices favored by regional Christian communities. The Basilica of San Pedro de Alcántara, constructed in the early 4th century near Malaga, demonstrates the architectural innovations developed by Hispanian Christian builders. The structure incorporated traditional Roman construction techniques, including concrete foundations and brick walls, but featured a distinctive apse design that provided enhanced acoustics for preaching and liturgical singing. The building's interior decorations combined Christian symbols with geometric patterns derived from indigenous Iberian artistic traditions, creating a visual environment that was both recognizably Christian and distinctively Hispanian. Priscillianism emerged in the late 4th century as a distinctive theological movement that would profoundly impact Hispanian Christianity and create lasting controversies throughout the Western Church. Priscillian, a wealthy layman from northwestern Hispania, developed theological teachings that emphasized ascetic practices, mystical spirituality, and the importance of personal religious experience over institutional authority. His ideas attracted significant followings among both clergy and laity, particularly in the rural areas of Galicia and northern Portugal, where traditional Roman religious practices had never achieved complete dominance. Priscillian's theological system incorporated elements from various sources, including Manichaean dualism, Gnostic spirituality, and traditional Christian teachings, creating a complex synthesis that appealed to populations seeking more intensive religious experiences than those provided by conventional Christian practices. His emphasis on strict fasting, sexual abstinence, and withdrawal from worldly concerns resonated with individuals who viewed the increasingly institutionalized church as having compromised its original spiritual intensity through accommodation with Roman society. The movement's appeal extended beyond theological considerations to encompass social and cultural factors that reflected tensions within Hispano-Roman society. Priscillian's followers included many women who found in his teachings opportunities for religious leadership and spiritual authority that were increasingly restricted within mainstream Christian communities. The movement's emphasis on personal religious experience and direct divine revelation provided alternatives to the hierarchical authority structures that dominated conventional church organization. Opposition to Priscillianism developed among bishops who viewed the movement's theological innovations and social practices as threats to orthodox Christian teaching and ecclesiastical authority. The Council of Zaragoza, convened in 380 AD, condemned several practices associated with Priscillian's followers, including their use of apocryphal texts, their distinctive fasting practices, and their inclusion of women in religious leadership roles. However, the council's condemnations failed to suppress the movement, which continued to attract followers throughout northwestern Hispania. The controversy surrounding Priscillianism intensified when secular authorities became involved in what had initially been purely ecclesiastical disputes. Emperor Magnus Maximus, seeking to demonstrate his orthodoxy and gain support from mainstream Christian bishops, ordered Priscillian's execution in 385 AD on charges of heresy and magic. This unprecedented use of secular power to resolve theological disputes created a significant precedent for future church-state relations, while generating sympathy for Priscillian's cause among populations who viewed his execution as unjust persecution. The aftermath of Priscillian's execution revealed the deep divisions within Hispanian Christianity and the complex relationships between religious authority, secular power, and popular religious sentiment. Many Christians, including some bishops who had opposed Priscillian's teachings, condemned his execution as inappropriate use of secular authority in religious matters. The controversy continued for decades, with Priscillianist communities maintaining their distinctive practices despite official condemnation and periodic persecution. The barbarian invasions that began in 409 AD shattered the Roman administrative system that had governed Hispania for over 4 centuries, creating political chaos that fundamentally altered the peninsula's social, economic, and religious structures. The Vandals, Alans, and Suebi who crossed the Pyrenees represented diverse Germanic peoples whose migration into Roman territory reflected complex pressures, including population growth, climate change, and conflicts with other tribal groups in Central and Eastern Europe. Their arrival in Hispania marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the peninsula's civilization. The initial barbarian crossing occurred during a particularly harsh winter when the Rhine River froze solid, allowing large numbers of people to cross from Germanic territories into Gaul. Contemporary accounts describe a massive migration involving not only warriors but entire populations, including women, children, elderly individuals, and livestock. These migrants faced desperate circumstances that made peaceful settlement preferable to continued wandering. But their arrival in Hispania created immediate conflicts with Roman authorities and established populations who viewed them as invaders and threats to existing social order. The Vandals, led by King Gunderic, initially settled in Baetica where they established control over the wealthy agricultural territories of the Guadalquivir Valley. Their occupation of this region disrupted the olive oil and wheat production that had sustained Roman commercial networks while providing the economic foundation for their emerging kingdom. Archaeological evidence from villa sites throughout Baetica reveals the destruction and abandonment of Roman agricultural installations, suggesting that the Vandal occupation involved significant violence and economic disruption. The Suebi established themselves in the northwestern territories of Galicia where they encountered populations that had maintained stronger connections to pre-Roman cultural traditions and had been less thoroughly integrated into Roman administrative systems. This region's mountainous terrain and dispersed settlement patterns provided advantages for the Suebi's traditional military tactics while limiting the effectiveness of Roman responses. The gradual Suebi conquest of Galician territories proceeded through a combination of military conquest and negotiated agreements with local leaders who recognized the collapse of Roman authority. The Alans, skilled horsemen from the steppes of Eastern Europe, initially occupied territories in Lusitania and Carthaginiensis where their cavalry tactics proved particularly effective against Roman forces attempting to maintain control of strategic locations. However, their relatively small numbers made them vulnerable to attacks from other barbarian groups and they were eventually absorbed by the Vandals through military conquest and political alliance. The Alan integration into Vandal society created a composite kingdom that combined different military traditions and cultural practices. The collapse of Roman administrative control proceeded gradually as imperial authorities proved unable to coordinate effective responses to barbarian occupation. The withdrawal of regular military units to defend more strategically important territories left Hispanian cities and rural areas dependent on local militias and private armies that lacked the training, equipment and organizational capabilities necessary to resist determined barbarian attacks. Many Roman officials abandoned their posts and fled to other provinces, taking with them the administrative expertise and institutional knowledge necessary for effective governance. Urban centers throughout Hispania experienced dramatic population declines as residents fled to more secure rural locations or emigrated to other provinces where Roman authority remained intact. Archaeological evidence from cities like Emerita Augusta and Corduba reveals the abandonment of public buildings, the deterioration of infrastructure including aqueducts and roads, and the conversion of former commercial and administrative areas into agricultural plots. These changes reflected both the immediate impact of barbarian occupation and the longer-term economic disruptions that accompanied the collapse of Roman commercial networks. The transformation of rural society accelerated as traditional villa estates were abandoned, destroyed, or converted to different forms of agricultural organization that reflected barbarian settlement patterns and economic practices. Many villa owners fled their properties, leaving behind elaborate residential complexes, agricultural installations, enslaved populations that were subsequently occupied by barbarian settlers. Archaeological excavations at villa sites throughout Hispania reveal evidence of this transition, including the modification of Roman buildings for different uses and the introduction of Germanic material culture. The social upheaval accompanying barbarian settlement created opportunities for significant changes in the relationships between different social groups within Hispanian society. The collapse of Roman legal systems and administrative structures eliminated many of the institutional barriers that had maintained social hierarchies. While the military success of barbarian groups demonstrated that traditional Roman claims to cultural and political superiority were no longer sustainable. Some members of the Roman elite maintained their positions through accommodation with barbarian rulers, while others lost their wealth and status through military defeat or economic disruption. Christian communities faced particular challenges during this period of political transition as they needed to maintain their religious organization and practices while adapting to new political authorities whose religious beliefs and cultural traditions differed significantly from Roman Christianity. Some barbarian groups, particularly the Vandals, had adopted Arian Christianity that conflicted with the Orthodox beliefs predominant among Hispano-Roman Christians. These theological differences created additional tensions that complicated the already difficult process of political and social accommodation between Roman and barbarian populations. The establishment of barbarian kingdoms throughout former Roman territories created unprecedented opportunities for political innovation and synthesis. Nowhere more dramatically than in Hispania, where the Visigoths would construct one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated and enduring political entities. The Visigothic settlement in southwestern Gaul during 418 AD, under the terms of a foides with Rome, marked the beginning of a transformation that would eventually encompass the entire Iberian Peninsula and create a unique civilization blending Germanic, Roman and indigenous traditions. The initial Visigothic territories, centered around Toulouse, provided the foundation for political institutions that would later be transplanted and adapted to Iberian conditions. King Theodoric I established administrative systems that maintained Roman legal traditions while incorporating Germanic concepts of personal loyalty and warrior leadership that reflected the military origins of Visigothic political authority. The kingdom's dual character, simultaneously Roman in its institutional structures and Germanic in its cultural values, created distinctive governmental forms that would influence European political development for centuries. Visigothic military organization retained many characteristics of the tribal warbands that had originally brought these peoples into Roman territory, but gradually incorporated Roman tactical concepts and administrative practices that enhanced their effectiveness in governing sedentary populations. The Visigothic army consisted primarily of free warriors who owed personal military service to the king in exchange for land grants and protection, creating feudal relationships that predated similar developments elsewhere in Europe by several centuries. These warriors, known as Gardingos, formed an elite military caste that dominated Visigothic society while serving as the primary instrument of royal authority. The weapons and equipment used by Visigothic warriors reflected both Germanic traditions and Roman influences, creating distinctive military technologies that combined the best elements of both cultures. Archaeological discoveries from Visigothic burial sites reveal sophisticated metalworking techniques that produced swords, spears and shields of exceptional quality. The characteristic Visigothic sword, longer and heavier than earlier Germanic weapons, incorporated Roman manufacturing methods while maintaining the distinctive hilts and decorative elements that identified their bearers' cultural origins and social status. Visigothic military tactics emphasized cavalry operations that took advantage of their warriors' exceptional horsemanship and the mobility advantages that mounted forces possessed over infantry formations. These tactical preferences reflected both the nomadic origins of Gothic peoples and their adaptation to the geographical conditions of southwestern Europe, where rapid movement across varied terrain provided decisive advantages in both conquest and defense. The integration of Roman siege techniques with Germanic cavalry tactics created combined arms capabilities that proved devastatingly effective against both Roman forces and rival barbarian groups. The expansion of Visigothic authority into Hispania began as a consequence of political developments in Gaul rather than deliberate imperial ambitions. The defeat and death of King Alaric II at the Battle of Vouille in 507 AD eliminated Visigothic control over most of their Gallic territories, forcing the survivors to retreat across the Pyrenees into regions that had been devastated by decades of barbarian occupation and civil warfare. This forced migration transformed what had been a relatively minor Visigothic presence in northeastern Hispania into the foundation for a new kingdom that would eventually dominate the entire peninsula. The establishment of Toledo as the Visigothic capital around 550 AD represented a crucial decision that would shape the kingdom's subsequent development and cultural character. The city's location in the geographic center of the peninsula provided strategic advantages for controlling territories that extended from the Pyrenees to the Strait of Gibraltar, while its position on the Tagus River facilitated communications and transportation throughout the kingdom. The choice of Toledo also demonstrated Visigothic confidence in their ability to govern Roman urban populations and maintain the complex administrative systems necessary for effective rule over diverse territories and peoples. The urban transformation of Toledo under Visigothic rule created one of early medieval Europe's most impressive capital cities. Combining Germanic royal traditions with Roman architectural concepts and Christian religious requirements. The royal palace complex, constructed on the city's highest elevation, dominated the urban landscape while providing appropriate settings for the ceremonial activities that reinforced royal authority and social hierarchy. Archaeological investigations have revealed sophisticated building techniques that incorporated Roman construction methods with Germanic decorative elements, creating architectural styles that were both functionally effective and culturally distinctive. The Cathedral of Toledo became the ecclesiastical center of Visigothic Christianity and the site of numerous church councils that would define both religious orthodoxy and political authority throughout the kingdom. The building's construction required coordination between royal authorities, ecclesiastical leaders and skilled craftsmen who created architectural solutions that accommodated both Christian liturgical requirements and Germanic concepts of royal ceremonial. The resulting structure combined Roman basilica designs with innovative spatial arrangements that reflected the unique characteristics of Visigothic Christian practice. The development of Visigothic legal systems represented one of the kingdom's most significant achievements and lasting contributions to European civilization. The Liber Judiciarum, promulgated by King Recuswinth around 654 AD, created a comprehensive legal code that applied equally to both Gothic and Roman populations throughout the kingdom. This revolutionary approach to legal administration eliminated the ethnic distinctions that had characterized earlier barbarian legal systems, creating unified governmental structures that facilitated political integration and social cohesion. The compilation of the Liber Judiciarum required extensive legal scholarship that drew upon Roman jurisprudential traditions, Germanic customary law and Christian theological principles to create coherent legal frameworks applicable to the complex social conditions existing within the kingdom. Teams of legal scholars, working under royal patronage, studied existing legal texts, consulted with experienced judges and administrators and conducted extensive deliberations to develop legal principles that balanced competing interests and cultural traditions. The resulting code addressed virtually every aspect of social, economic and political life with unprecedented comprehensiveness and sophistication. Property law provisions within the Liber Judiciarum established clear principles for land ownership, inheritance and commercial transactions that protected both individual rights and community interests. The code recognized various forms of property ownership including individual holdings, family estates and communal lands, while establishing procedures for resolving disputes that might arise from competing claims or unclear boundaries. These provisions facilitated economic development by providing legal certainty that encouraged investment and commercial activity, while preventing the social conflicts that could destabilize political authority. Criminal law sections of the code established systematic approaches to justice that balanced punishment with compensation, reflecting both Roman concepts of legal procedure and Germanic traditions of personal honor and family responsibility. The code specified detailed punishments for various offenses ranging from theft and assault to treason and religious crimes, while establishing procedural safeguards that protected accused individuals from arbitrary treatment. The emphasis on compensation rather than purely punitive measures reflected practical recognition that excessive punishment could create cycles of revenge that threatened social stability. Family law provisions addressed marriage, divorce, inheritance and parental authority in ways that reflected Christian moral teachings while accommodating practical social needs and Germanic cultural traditions. The code established minimum ages for marriage, prohibited marriages between close relatives and regulated divorce procedures to protect both parties' interests and ensure appropriate care for children. These provisions created legal frameworks that strengthened family structures while providing flexibility to address exceptional circumstances that might require modification of standard arrangements. Commercial law sections facilitated economic development by establishing clear rules for contracts, partnerships and trade relationships that enabled merchants and craftsmen to conduct business with confidence and legal protection. The code specified procedures for forming valid contracts, resolving commercial disputes and enforcing payment obligations that protected both buyers and sellers while encouraging economic activity. These provisions were particularly important in a kingdom that encompassed diverse economic regions with different commercial traditions and practices. The complex relationship between Gothic rulers and Hispano-Roman subjects required careful political management that balanced Germanic concepts of personal loyalty with Roman traditions of administrative efficiency and legal equality. The Visigothic nobility, descended from the warrior bands that had originally conquered the territory, maintained privileged positions within the kingdom's social hierarchy while gradually adapting to the governing sedentary populations with sophisticated economic and cultural systems. This adaptation process created tensions between traditional Germanic values and the practical necessities of effective administration. Hispano-Roman elites who had survived the barbarian invasions and political upheavals of the 5th century found opportunities to maintain and even enhance their social positions through collaboration with Visigothic rulers who needed their administrative expertise and local knowledge. These Roman families possessed educational backgrounds, legal training and cultural sophistication that made them valuable advisors and administrators. While their established relationships with local populations facilitated the implementation of royal policies throughout the kingdom, the gradual integration of Roman and Gothic elites created composite ruling classes that combined the military capabilities of Germanic warriors with the administrative skills of Roman bureaucrats. The process of cultural synthesis between Gothic and Roman populations proceeded gradually through intermarriage, shared participation in government and the development of common institutions that served both communities' interests. Archaeological evidence from urban and rural sites throughout the kingdom reveals the gradual blending of material cultures as Gothic settlers adopted Roman architectural styles, agricultural techniques and craft traditions, while contributing their own artistic motifs, technological innovations and social practices. This cultural fusion created distinctive Hispano-Visigothic traditions that differed significantly from contemporary developments in other former Roman territories. Religious conversion represented the most dramatic aspect of Visigothic cultural transformation and political development. The majority of Visigothic peoples had adopted Arian Christianity during their earlier migrations through the Roman Empire, accepting theological teachings that denied the full divinity of Christ and rejected the Trinitarian doctrines that had become orthodox within Roman Christianity. This religious difference created significant barriers to integration with Hispano-Roman populations who remained committed to Orthodox Catholic beliefs and viewed Arianism as dangerous heresy. King Ricard I's conversion to Catholicism in 587 AD marked a watershed moment in Visigothic history that fundamentally altered the kingdom's political dynamics and cultural trajectory. Ricard's decision reflected both personal religious conviction and practical political calculations about the advantages of religious unity within his diverse kingdom. The conversion required careful preparation and extensive consultation with both Gothic nobles and Catholic bishops to ensure that the religious transformation would strengthen rather than destabilize royal authority. The Third Council of Toledo convened in 589 AD to formalize the Visigothic conversion to Catholicism, represented one of the most significant ecclesiastical assemblies in early medieval European history. The council brought together Visigothic nobles, Catholic bishops and representatives from throughout the kingdom to witness and approve the formal renunciation of Arianism and acceptance of Orthodox Catholic doctrine. The proceedings required careful orchestration to demonstrate both the sincerity of the conversion and the unanimous support of the kingdom's leadership for the religious transformation. The political implications of religious conversion extended far beyond theological considerations to encompass fundamental changes in the relationship between royal authority and ecclesiastical power. Catholic bishops, who had previously operated under the suspicious oversight of Arian rulers, suddenly found themselves in positions of influence and partnership with royal government. This transformation created opportunities for increased church involvement in political affairs while providing kings with powerful allies who could help legitimize royal authority and maintain social order throughout the kingdom. The integration of Catholic and royal authority proceeded through the development of institutional structures that balanced ecclesiastical independence with political cooperation. Regular church councils convened under royal auspices provided forums where bishops and royal officials could address common concerns, resolve disputes and coordinate policies that affected both religious and secular affairs. These councils became crucial elements of Visigothic governance, creating mechanisms for consultation and decision-making that enhanced the effectiveness of both church and state institutions. Cultural achievements during the Visigothic period reflected the creative synthesis of diverse traditions and the patronage provided by both royal and ecclesiastical authorities who recognized the importance of cultural development for political legitimacy and social cohesion. Architectural innovations combined Germanic structural concepts with Roman building techniques and Christian liturgical requirements, creating distinctive styles that influenced subsequent European architectural development. The churches constructed during this period featured innovative spatial arrangements, sophisticated decorative programs and engineering solutions that demonstrated remarkable technical and artistic capabilities. The Church of San Juan de Baños, built by King Ricosuanth around 661 AD, exemplifies the architectural sophistication achieved during the Visigothic period. The building's design incorporated Roman basilica concepts with Germanic decorative elements and innovative structural features that created interior spaces particularly well suited to Christian worship. The use of horseshoe arches, which would later become characteristic of Islamic architecture in Hispania, demonstrates the experimental nature of Visigothic architectural development and the willingness of builders to explore new structural possibilities. Decorative arts flourished under Visigothic patronage, producing metalwork, jewelry and textile arts that combined Germanic artistic traditions with Roman craftsmanship techniques and Christian symbolic content. The treasure discovered at Guaraza near Toledo reveals the extraordinary quality of Visigothic goldsmithing and the sophisticated artistic sensibilities of royal and ecclesiastical patrons. These votive crowns, created for donation to churches, feature complex geometric designs, precious stone settings and inscriptions that demonstrate both technical mastery and deep religious devotion. Manuscript illumination developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring throughout Visigothic society. Scriptoriums established in major churches and monasteries produced religious texts decorated with artistic programs that combined Germanic interlace patterns, Roman naturalistic elements and Christian iconographic content. The techniques developed by Visigothic illuminators influenced manuscript production throughout medieval Europe while creating artistic traditions that would survive the Islamic conquest and continue to influence Iberian cultural development. The scholarly achievements of figures like Isidore of Seville represented the intellectual culmination of Visigothic cultural synthesis and demonstrated the kingdom's contribution to European learning and cultural development. Isidore, who served as Archbishop of Seville from 600 to 636 AD, produced encyclopedic works that preserved and transmitted classical knowledge while adapting ancient learning to contemporary Christian needs. His Etymologies, a comprehensive survey of human knowledge organized according to linguistic principles, became one of medieval Europe's most influential educational texts. Isidore's scholarly methodology combined Roman educational traditions with Germanic practical concerns and Christian theological frameworks, creating synthetic approaches to learning that reflected the cultural diversity of Visigothic society. His works address topics ranging from theology and philosophy to natural science and practical arts, demonstrating both the breadth of knowledge available in Visigothic libraries and the intellectual ambitions of educated elites who sought to maintain cultural continuity despite political upheavals. The preservation and transmission of classical texts through Isidore's efforts proved crucial for subsequent European intellectual development. The establishment of educational institutions throughout the Visigothic kingdom created networks of learning that served both practical administrative needs and broader cultural objectives. Cathedral schools in major cities provided education for clergy and lay administrators, while monastic schools in rural areas preserved and copied manuscripts that might otherwise have been lost during periods of political instability. These institutions maintained educational standards that enabled the kingdom to produce the trained personnel necessary for effective government while contributing to broader European intellectual life. Internal political instability increasingly characterized the later Visigothic period as succession disputes, noble rivalries, and regional conflicts weakened royal authority and undermined the kingdom's defensive capabilities. The elective nature of Visigothic kingship, which had originally provided flexibility in choosing capable rulers, became a source of chronic instability as competing factions supported different candidates and used succession crises to advance their own interests. The absence of clear hereditary principles created opportunities for ambitious nobles to challenge royal authority and pursue independent political agendas. Succession crises occurred with increasing frequency during the 7th century as the deaths of kings precipitated conflicts between rival claimants and their aristocratic supporters. These disputes often involved military confrontations that devastated particular regions while consuming resources that might otherwise have been used for defense against external threats. The kingdom's fragmentation into competing factions reduced its ability to coordinate effective responses to emerging challenges while encouraging potential enemies to exploit internal divisions. Regional autonomy gradually increased as local nobles accumulated independent power bases that enabled them to resist royal authority and pursue policies that served their particular interests rather than broader kingdom needs. The mountainous terrain of northern regions provided natural defenses that made central control difficult to maintain, while the wealth of southern territories enabled local leaders to maintain private armies that could challenge royal forces. This decentralization of political authority undermined the unified governmental structures that had been the Visigothic kingdom's greatest achievement. The gradual weakening of royal authority created conditions that would facilitate the Islamic conquest of 711 AD as internal divisions prevented effective coordination of defensive efforts while encouraging some nobles to view foreign invasion as an opportunity to advance their own political positions. The kingdom that had once represented one of early medieval Europe's most successful experiments in cultural synthesis and governmental innovation had become vulnerable to external conquest through the very political processes that had originally enabled its creation and expansion. The political fragmentation that had weakened the Visigothic kingdom created the perfect conditions for one of history's most rapid and complete military conquests. In April 711 AD, a Berber commander named Tariq ibn Ziyad landed near the massive limestone promontory that would bear his name, Jabal Tariq or Gibraltar, with a force of approximately 7,000 warriors. This modest invasion force, consisting primarily of recently Islamized Berber tribesmen from the Maghreb along with a smaller contingent of Arab cavalry, would within 8 years control virtually the entire Iberian Peninsula and establish a civilization that would endure for nearly 8 centuries. The initial landing took place at night, with Tariq's forces using small boats to ferry troops and equipment across the narrow strait separating Africa from Europe. Contemporary accounts describe the methodical organization of this crossing, with advanced scouts having already identified suitable landing sites and established contact with disaffected Visigothic nobles who viewed the Islamic invasion as an opportunity to advance their own political positions. The rocky coastline provided natural defensive positions that enabled the invading force to establish a secure beachhead while awaiting reinforcements and supplies from North Africa. King Roderick, the last Visigothic monarch, received news of the invasion while campaigning against Basque rebels in the northern mountains. The timing of Tariq's landing had been carefully calculated to exploit the kingdom's internal divisions and the absence of royal forces from the southern territories. Radaik's hasty march southward with whatever troops he could gather demonstrated the kingdom's inability to coordinate effective defensive measures, as regional nobles either refused to provide military assistance or actively collaborated with the invading forces. The decisive confrontation occurred near the Guadaleta River in July 711 AD, where Radaik's hastily assembled army met Tariq's forces in a battle that would determine the fate of Visigothic Hispania. The Visigothic army, despite its numerical superiority, suffered from the political divisions that had plagued the kingdom for decades. Several key nobles, including the sons of former King Widiza who had been deposed by Radaik, either withdrew their forces during the battle or actively switched sides to support the Islamic invaders. The battle itself unfolded over several days of maneuvering and skirmishing before culminating in a decisive engagement that showcased the tactical advantages possessed by the Islamic forces. Tariq's cavalry, composed of experienced Arab horsemen supported by Berber mounted archers, demonstrated superior mobility and coordination compared to the Visigothic heavy cavalry that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. The Islamic forces employed feigned retreats and coordinated charges that disrupted Visigothic formations while preventing their opponents from utilizing their traditional advantages in close combat. The death of King Radaik during the battle eliminated the last symbol of unified Visigothic resistance and triggered the complete collapse of organized opposition throughout the kingdom. Archaeological evidence from the battlefield site reveals the scale of the Visigothic defeat, with weapon deposits and skeletal remains indicating that entire units were destroyed during the final phases of the engagement. The loss of the royal army, combined with the death of numerous nobles and military commanders, left the kingdom's remaining territories defenseless against continued Islamic expansion. Musa ibn Nusair, the Arab governor of North Africa who had originally authorized Tariq's expedition, arrived in Hispania during 712 AD with a larger force of approximately 18,000 warriors, including a substantial contingent of Arab cavalry and infantry. Musa's arrival transformed what had begun as a limited raiding expedition into a systematic conquest campaign designed to establish permanent Islamic control over the entire peninsula. The combined forces under Musa and Tariq possessed both the military capabilities and administrative expertise necessary to govern the diverse populations and territories they were rapidly acquiring. The conquest proceeded with remarkable speed as Islamic forces encountered minimal organized resistance from the remaining Visigothic strongholds. Major cities throughout the peninsula either surrendered without fighting or fell after brief sieges that demonstrated the futility of resistance against the well-organized Islamic armies. Toledo, the former Visigothic capital, surrendered in 712 AD after its defenders recognized that continued resistance would only result in unnecessary destruction and civilian casualties. The terms of surrender negotiated at Toledo established precedents that would govern Islamic treatment of conquered populations throughout the peninsula. Christian and Jewish communities received protection for their religious practices, property rights, and traditional legal systems in exchange for payment of tribute taxes and acknowledgement of Islamic political authority. These arrangements, formalized in written agreements known as capitulations, provided stability and continuity that facilitated the transition from Visigothic to Islamic rule while encouraging cooperation from existing administrative and religious elites. The rapid collapse of Visigothic resistance reflected not only the military effectiveness of the Islamic forces but also the fundamental weaknesses that had developed within the kingdom during the preceding decades. Many Hispano-Roman populations viewed the Islamic conquest as liberation from oppressive Visigothic taxation and religious persecution, while Jewish communities welcomed rulers who promised tolerance and protection after centuries of discrimination under Christian governance. The Islamic emphasis on administrative efficiency and religious tolerance contrasted favorably with the arbitrary rule and sectarian conflicts that had characterized the later Visigothic period. The establishment of Islamic administrative systems began immediately following the military conquest as Musa and Tariq recognized the importance of creating stable governmental structures that could effectively manage their newly acquired territories. The peninsula was initially organized as a province of the Umayyad Caliphate based in Damascus, with Córdoba serving as the administrative capital due to its central location and existing infrastructure. The choice of Córdoba also reflected practical considerations about controlling the wealthy agricultural territories of the Guadalquivir Valley while maintaining communications with North Africa. The early Islamic administration in Al-Andalus, as the conquered territories became known, operated through a sophisticated system that balanced Arab political authority with practical accommodation of existing social and economic structures. Arab governors appointed from Damascus exercised supreme political and military authority, but they relied heavily on existing administrative personnel and local knowledge to implement policies and collect taxes. This pragmatic approach enabled the rapid establishment of effective governance while minimizing disruption to economic activities and social relationships. The development of a distinctive Andalusi Islamic culture began during these early decades as Arab and Berber settlers interacted with existing Hispano-Roman and Visigothic populations. The process of cultural synthesis occurred gradually through intermarriage, religious conversion and shared participation in economic activities that created new social categories and cultural practices. The term Muladi emerged to describe Christians who converted to Islam while retaining many of their traditional cultural practices, while Mozarabs referred to Christians who maintained their religious beliefs while adopting Arabic language and Islamic cultural elements. The agricultural transformation of Al-Andalus represented one of the most significant achievements of early Islamic rule and demonstrated the technological innovations that Muslim settlers brought from their eastern Mediterranean and North African homelands. Islamic agricultural experts introduced sophisticated irrigation systems that dramatically increased the productivity of existing farmlands while enabling the cultivation of previously barren areas. These irrigation networks known as acequias utilized gravity-fed channels, underground aqueducts and mechanical devices including water wheels and pumps that maximized the efficient distribution of water resources. The introduction of new crops revolutionized Andalusi agriculture and created the foundation for unprecedented economic prosperity. Islamic settlers brought rice, sugarcane, cotton, citrus fruits and numerous vegetables that had been unknown in Visigothic Hispania while introducing improved varieties of existing crops including wheat, barley and grapes. These agricultural innovations required extensive knowledge of soil conditions, climate patterns and cultivation techniques that Islamic farmers had developed through centuries of experience in similar Mediterranean environments. The expansion of agricultural production enabled significant population growth and urbanization throughout Al-Andalus as increased food supplies could support larger concentrations of people in cities and towns. Archaeological evidence from urban sites reveals rapid expansion of residential areas, commercial districts and craft production facilities that reflected growing prosperity and economic diversification. The integration of agricultural surplus with expanding craft production created complex economic relationships that connected rural and urban areas through networks of trade and exchange. Urban planning in Islamic Al-Andalus incorporated architectural concepts and city design principles that reflected both practical considerations and cultural values derived from Islamic civilization. The typical Andalusi city featured a central mosque surrounded by commercial areas, residential quarters organized according to ethnic and religious affiliations, and defensive walls that provided protection while regulating access to urban resources. These urban designs facilitated both commercial activities and social interactions while maintaining the security and order necessary for continued prosperity. The Great Mosque of Córdoba, begun during the 780s under Abd al-Rahman I, exemplified the architectural innovations that characterized early Andalusi Islamic culture. The mosque's design incorporated elements from various Islamic architectural traditions while adapting to local materials and construction techniques that created distinctive regional characteristics. The building's famous horseshoe arches, constructed using alternating red brick and white stone, created visual effects that were both aesthetically striking and structurally efficient, while the forest of columns supporting the roof created interior spaces that could accommodate thousands of worshippers. The mosque's expansion over successive centuries reflected both the growing Muslim population of Córdoba and the increasing wealth and sophistication of Andalusi Islamic civilization. Each edition incorporated architectural innovations and decorative elements that demonstrated the evolving artistic capabilities of local craftsmen while maintaining overall design coherence that unified the entire structure. The mihrab or prayer niche added during the 10th century featured intricate geometric patterns, calligraphic inscriptions and precious materials that represented the pinnacle of Andalusi decorative arts. The establishment of the Umayyad Emirate in 756 AD marked a crucial turning point in Andalusi political development and created the conditions for the flowering of independent Islamic civilization in the peninsula. Abd al-Rahman I, a survivor of the Abbasid massacre of the Umayyad dynasty in Damascus, successfully established his authority in Córdoba after years of political maneuvering and military campaigns against rival claimants and local opposition. His success in creating a stable independent emirate demonstrated both his personal capabilities and the political opportunities available in Al-Andalus for ambitious leaders who could navigate the complex relationships between different ethnic and religious communities. The consolidation of Umayyad authority required careful management of the diverse populations that comprised Andalusi society, including Arabs who claimed superior status as the original conquerors, Berbers who had provided the majority of the invasion forces but felt excluded from political power, and the various categories of indigenous populations who had adapted differently to Islamic rule. Abd al-Rahman's political success depended on his ability to balance these competing interests while maintaining military capabilities sufficient to defend his territories against both internal rebellions and external threats. The development of a sophisticated administrative system enabled the Umayyad Emirate to govern its diverse territories effectively while extracting the resources necessary to support an increasingly elaborate court culture and military establishment. The administrative structure combined Islamic governmental principles with practical adaptations to local conditions, creating bureaucratic institutions that could manage complex tasks including tax collection, military recruitment, judicial administration, and public works projects. The efficiency of these administrative systems enabled the emirate to support population levels and economic activities that exceeded those achieved during the Visigothic period. The cultural achievements of the Umayyad period reflected the creative synthesis of diverse traditions and the patronage provided by rulers who recognized the importance of cultural development for political legitimacy and social cohesion. The court at Córdoba became a center of learning and artistic production that attracted scholars, poets, musicians, and craftsmen from throughout the Islamic world and beyond. This cultural patronage created an environment where intellectual and artistic innovation could flourish while contributing to the development of distinctive Andalusi traditions that influenced cultural development throughout medieval Europe. The translation movement that developed in Al-Andalus during the 9th and 10th centuries facilitated the preservation and transmission of classical knowledge while contributing to intellectual developments that would influence European scholarship for centuries. Islamic scholars in Córdoba, Toledo, and other major centers worked systematically to translate Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, often using Latin or Hebrew intermediate versions that had been preserved in Christian and Jewish libraries. These translation efforts preserved works that might otherwise have been lost while making classical knowledge available to Islamic scholars who could build upon ancient foundations to develop new insights and discoveries. The medical schools established in Córdoba and other Andalusi cities achieved international recognition for their advanced teaching methods and clinical practices that combined Greek theoretical knowledge with Islamic medical innovations and practical experience. These institutions trained physicians who served not only Islamic populations but also Christian and Jewish communities that valued their superior medical knowledge and treatment capabilities. The medical texts produced by Andalusi physicians, including surgical manuals and pharmaceutical guides, were translated into Latin and used throughout medieval Europe. Mathematical and astronomical studies flourished under Umayyad patronage as Islamic scholars built upon Greek, Indian, and Persian mathematical traditions while developing new computational methods and astronomical observations. The astronomical tables compiled by Andalusi mathematicians provided more accurate calculations for religious and navigational purposes, while their mathematical innovations, including improved algebraic techniques and geometric proofs, contributed to intellectual developments throughout the Islamic world. These scholarly achievements demonstrated the high level of intellectual culture that had developed in Al-Andalus within 2 centuries of the Islamic conquest. The complex relationships between Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Al-Andalus created a social environment that facilitated cultural exchange while maintaining distinct religious and ethnic identities. The Islamic principle of dhimma provided legal protection for people of the book who accepted Islamic political authority while maintaining their traditional religious practices. This arrangement enabled Christian and Jewish communities to preserve their cultural traditions while participating in the broader economic and intellectual life of Andalusi society. Christian communities, known as Mozarabs, developed distinctive cultural practices that combined traditional Christian religious observances with Arabic language use and Islamic cultural elements. Mozarab churches incorporated architectural features derived from Islamic models while maintaining Christian liturgical requirements, creating hybrid architectural styles that reflected the cultural synthesis occurring throughout Andalusi society. The preservation of Christian religious texts in Arabic translation enabled the continuation of Christian scholarly traditions while facilitating intellectual exchange with Islamic and Jewish scholars. Jewish communities experienced unprecedented prosperity and cultural flowering under Islamic rule as the tolerant policies of Umayyad rulers enabled them to pursue commercial, intellectual, and artistic activities that had been restricted under Visigothic Christian governance. Jewish merchants established extensive trade networks that connected Al-Andalus with Jewish communities throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. While Jewish scholars made significant contributions to philosophy, medicine, poetry, and religious studies that influenced both Islamic and Christian intellectual development. The economic prosperity that characterized 10th-century Al-Andalus reflected the successful integration of diverse populations and resources within a unified political framework that encouraged productive activities while maintaining social stability. Agricultural productivity continued to increase through the expansion of irrigation systems and the introduction of new crops and cultivation techniques, while craft production achieved levels of sophistication that enabled Andalusi products to compete successfully in international markets. The combination of agricultural surplus and manufacturing excellence created wealth that supported both elaborate court culture and extensive public works projects. Commercial networks connecting Al-Andalus with the broader Islamic world and Christian Europe facilitated the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies that contributed to continued economic growth and cultural development. Andalusi merchants established trading relationships that extended from the Baltic Sea to sub-Saharan Africa, while the peninsula's strategic location enabled it to serve as an intermediary between European and Islamic commercial systems. The profits from this extensive trade supported urban development, cultural patronage, and military capabilities that maintained Andalusi independence and prosperity. The proclamation of the Caliphate of Córdoba in 929 AD by Abd al-Rahman III represented the political and cultural culmination of Umayyad rule in Al-Andalus. This declaration of independence from Abbasid authority reflected both the emirate's military and economic strength and its ruler's confidence in his ability to compete with other Islamic powers for political and religious leadership. The assumption of the caliphal title demonstrated Andalusi aspirations to equal status with the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad and the Fatimid caliphs of Cairo, while asserting religious authority over Islamic communities in Al-Andalus and beyond. The construction of Medinat al-Zahra, the magnificent palace city built by Abd al-Rahman III near Córdoba, symbolized the wealth and cultural sophistication achieved by the Umayyad Caliphate, while providing an appropriate setting for the elaborate court ceremonies that reinforced caliphal authority. The palace complex, covering over 100 hectares, incorporated the most advanced architectural and engineering techniques available while demonstrating the artistic capabilities of Andalusi craftsmen. The buildings featured intricate stone carving, elaborate geometric patterns, and sophisticated water features that created environments of unprecedented luxury and beauty. The administrative innovations developed during the Caliphal period created governmental systems that effectively managed the Caliphate's extensive territories while maintaining the delicate balance between different ethnic and religious communities that had enabled Andalusi prosperity. The bureaucratic institutions established in Córdoba combined Islamic administrative principles with practical adaptations to local conditions, creating efficient systems for tax collection, military organization, judicial administration, and public works management that served as models for other Islamic states. The death of al-Muzaffar in 1008 AD precipitated a succession crisis that would ultimately destroy the Umayyad Caliphate and fragment al-Andalus into dozens of competing kingdoms. The fitna, or civil war, that erupted following the disputed succession revealed the underlying tensions that had developed within Andalusi society during 3 centuries of Umayyad rule. Regional governors, military commanders, and local notables who had previously submitted to caliphal authority now pursued independent political agendas, transforming administrative provinces into autonomous kingdoms that would reshape the political landscape of medieval Iberia. The initial phase of the civil war centered around Córdoba itself, where rival claimants to the caliphal throne mobilized different factions within the capital's diverse population. The Berber military units that had served as the backbone of caliphal military power found themselves competing with Slavic palace guards and Arab aristocratic families for control of the government apparatus. Street fighting devastated entire neighborhoods of the capital as different ethnic groups settled old grievances while pursuing immediate political advantages. The magnificent libraries and workshops that had made Córdoba the intellectual center of Western Europe suffered extensive damage as buildings were looted and scholars fled to safer territories. The sack of Medinat al-Zahra in 1010 AD symbolized the complete collapse of centralized Umayyad authority and marked the definitive end of the caliphal system that had governed al-Andalus for over 2 centuries. Berber forces, frustrated by their exclusion from political power despite their military contributions, systematically destroyed the palace complex that had represented the pinnacle of Andalusi architectural achievement. Contemporary accounts describe the methodical dismantling of marble columns, the removal of precious decorative elements, and the destruction of water features that had taken decades to construct. The abandonment of this magnificent site demonstrated that the political and cultural unity that had sustained Andalusi civilization could no longer be maintained through traditional governmental structures. By 1031 AD the last Umayyad caliph had been deposed and al-Andalus had fragmented into approximately 30 independent kingdoms known as taifas. These successor states varied dramatically in size, population, and resources ranging from major kingdoms centered on cities like Seville, Granada, and Zaragoza, to minor principalities controlling only a single fortified town and its immediate surroundings. The rulers of these taifas, drawn from diverse backgrounds including Arab aristocrats, Berber military commanders, and Slavic palace officials, faced the challenge of establishing legitimate authority while competing with numerous rivals for territory and resources. The Taifa of Seville emerged as one of the most powerful and culturally significant of these successor states under the Abbasid dynasty founded by Abu al-Qasim Muhammad ibn Abbad. The kingdom's strategic location in the fertile Guadalquivir Valley provided agricultural wealth that could support both military forces and cultural patronage, while its proximity to the Atlantic coast facilitated trade relationships with North Africa and the broader Islamic world. The Abbasid rulers transformed Seville into a major center of Arabic poetry and learning that attracted scholars and artists from throughout Al-Andalus and beyond. The court culture that developed in Seville during the 11th century represented both the continuation of Umayyad traditions and innovative adaptations to the changed political circumstances of the Taifa period. Al-Mu'tamid ibn Abbad, who ruled from 1069 to 1091 AD, exemplified the sophisticated patron rulers who emerged during this era. His own poetry, composed in classical Arabic forms while incorporating themes and imagery specific to Andalusi experience, demonstrated the high level of cultural achievement that individual Taifa courts could sustain despite their limited territorial extent and constant military pressures. The architectural projects undertaken in Seville during the Abbasid period showcased the continued vitality of Andalusi artistic traditions while adapting to the reduced resources available to Taifa rulers. The Alcazar of Seville, extensively renovated during this period, incorporated decorative elements and spatial arrangements that maintained the luxury and sophistication associated with Islamic royal residences while operating within the financial constraints imposed by the kingdom's limited territorial base. The building's courtyards, reception halls and private apartments demonstrated that skilled craftsmen and artistic traditions had survived the political fragmentation of Al-Andalus. The Taifa of Granada, established by the Zirid dynasty, controlled the mountainous territories of southeastern Al-Andalus that would later become the last Islamic stronghold in the peninsula. The kingdom's capital, strategically located at the confluence of the Genil and Darro rivers beneath the Sierra Nevada mountains, provided natural defensive advantages that enabled the Zirids to maintain their independence despite pressure from both Christian kingdoms and rival taifas. The agricultural productivity of the Vega, or fertile plains surrounding Granada, supplied the economic foundation necessary to support the kingdom's military and administrative requirements. The Zirid rulers invested heavily in fortification projects that transformed Granada into one of Al-Andalus' most formidable defensive positions. The construction of the Alcazaba, a massive fortress complex dominating the city's highest elevation, required sophisticated engineering techniques that incorporated lessons learned from centuries of Islamic military architecture. The fortress walls, built using rammed earth construction reinforced with stone, could withstand prolonged sieges while providing secure refuges for the royal family and government officials during periods of crisis. The Taifa of Zaragoza, governed by the Banu Hud dynasty, controlled the strategic Ebro Valley that connected Al-Andalus with the Pyrenean passes leading to Christian territories. This geographic position enabled the kingdom to profit from trade relationships with both Islamic and Christian merchants, while maintaining military capabilities sufficient to defend against attacks from multiple directions. The rulers of Zaragoza pursued pragmatic policies that balanced cooperation with Christian kingdoms against the need to maintain their Islamic identity and political independence. The Al-Jafaria Palace, constructed in Zaragoza during the 11th century, demonstrated the architectural innovations that Taifa rulers could achieve when they concentrated resources on specific projects, rather than attempting to maintain the extensive building programs that had characterized the Umayyad period. The palace's octagonal throne room featured intricate geometric decorations and sophisticated structural engineering that created interior spaces of remarkable beauty and acoustic quality. The building's integration of defensive and residential functions reflected the military pressures that constantly threatened Taifa rulers, while maintaining the ceremonial requirements necessary for effective political authority. The cultural flowering that occurred in many Taifa courts during the 11th century paradoxically coincided with increasing political instability and military vulnerability. The competitive environment created by political fragmentation encouraged individual rulers to patronize scholars, poets, and artists as means of enhancing their prestige and legitimacy. This cultural competition produced remarkable achievements in Arabic poetry, philosophical scholarship, and scientific investigation that continued the intellectual traditions established during the Umayyad period, while adapting to new political circumstances. Ibn Hazm, the great Andalusi polymath, who lived through the transition from Caliphate to Taifa rule, exemplified the intellectual achievements possible during this period of political fragmentation. His philosophical and theological works, produced while moving between different Taifa courts, demonstrated the continued vitality of Andalusi scholarship, while addressing the practical challenges faced by Islamic communities adapting to changed political circumstances. His treatise on Love, the Ring of the Dove, combined sophisticated literary analysis with psychological insights that influenced both Islamic and later European literary traditions. The military weakness of individual Taifa kingdoms became increasingly apparent as Christian forces from the northern mountains began expanding southward during the 11th century. The fragmentation of Islamic political authority eliminated the coordinated defensive capabilities that had previously protected Al-Andalus from Christian expansion, while competition between Taifa rulers prevented effective cooperation against common threats. Some Taifa kings even allied with Christian forces against their Islamic neighbors, prioritizing short-term tactical advantages over long-term strategic considerations about the survival of Islamic political authority in the peninsula. The tribute payments, known as pariahs, that many Taifa rulers agreed to pay to Christian kingdoms represented both a pragmatic response to military pressure and a fundamental transformation in the political relationship between Islamic and Christian territories. These payments, often substantial portions of Taifa revenues, provided Christian kingdoms with the financial resources necessary to support expanded military forces while simultaneously weakening Islamic defensive capabilities. The pariah system created economic dependencies that gradually shifted the balance of power in favor of Christian expansion. The emergence of powerful Christian kingdoms in the northern regions of the peninsula occurred simultaneously with the fragmentation of Islamic political authority and represented the culmination of centuries of gradual territorial expansion and political consolidation. The Kingdom of Leon, which had evolved from the Asturian monarchy established during the 8th century, controlled extensive territories from the Cantabrian Mountains to the Duero River Valley. The kingdom's capital at Leon served as the center of a sophisticated administrative system that managed diverse populations including Christians, Muslims and Jews who had been incorporated through conquest and voluntary submission. The Leonese monarchy developed distinctive governmental institutions that combined Visigothic legal traditions with innovations adapted to the requirements of frontier warfare and territorial expansion. The royal court maintained elaborate ceremonial protocols that reinforced monarchical authority while providing forums for consultation with noble families, ecclesiastical leaders and representatives from major urban centers. The fueros or local charters granted to frontier communities provided legal frameworks that encouraged settlement and economic development while maintaining royal authority over strategic territories. The military organization of the Leonese kingdom reflected the constant warfare that characterized frontier regions where Christian and Islamic territories intersected. The royal army combined heavily armored cavalry forces modeled on European feudal practices with light cavalry units that adopted tactical innovations learned through contact with Islamic military traditions. Infantry forces recruited from both urban militias and rural populations provided the numerical strength necessary for siege operations and defensive campaigns that could last for extended periods. The County of Castile emerged during the 10th century as a semi-autonomous region within the Kingdom of Leon governed by counts who exercised increasing independence while nominally acknowledging Leonese royal authority. The county's strategic location along the Duero River frontier provided opportunities for territorial expansion and military glory that attracted ambitious nobles and landless warriors from throughout Christian Iberia. The distinctive Castilian identity that developed during this period emphasized military valor, territorial expansion, and resistance to both Islamic and Leonese political authority. Fernan González, Count of Castile from 930 to 970 AD, exemplified the ambitious frontier nobles who transformed military success into political independence. His campaigns against Islamic territories expanded Castilian boundaries while providing the booty and tribute necessary to reward followers and finance further military ventures. His conflicts with Leonese royal authority demonstrated the centrifugal forces that operated within Christian kingdoms as successful military leaders pursued independent political agendas that challenged traditional hierarchical relationships. The gradual transformation of Castile from county to kingdom occurred through a combination of military success, strategic marriages, and political maneuvering that enabled Castilian rulers to achieve equal status with their former Leonese overlords. The union of Castile and Leon under Ferdinand I in 1037 AD created the largest and most powerful Christian kingdom in the peninsula with territorial extent and military capabilities that could challenge Islamic political authority throughout Al-Andalus. This political consolidation provided the foundation for the systematic expansion that would characterize Christian-Islamic relations during the subsequent 2 centuries. The Kingdom of Navarre, centered in the Pyrenean valleys that had never been fully incorporated into either Visigothic or Islamic political systems, developed distinctive characteristics that reflected its geographic isolation and cultural diversity. The kingdom's population included Basque-speaking communities that maintained pre-Roman cultural traditions. Latin-speaking populations descended from Hispano-Roman settlers and various groups of Christian refugees who had fled Islamic territories during the conquest period. This cultural diversity created challenges for royal authority while providing military and economic resources that enabled Navarre to maintain its independence against larger neighbors. Sancho III the Great, who ruled Navarre from 1004 to 1035 AD, transformed the kingdom into the dominant Christian power in northern Iberia through a combination of military conquest, strategic marriages and diplomatic alliances that extended Navarre's influence throughout the region. His control over the pilgrimage routes leading to Santiago de Compostela provided both economic benefits and political leverage that enabled him to intervene in the affairs of neighboring kingdoms while maintaining his own territorial integrity. The division of his territories among his sons following his death created the conditions for subsequent conflicts between Christian kingdoms that would influence Iberian political development for centuries. The Kingdom of Aragon emerged from the mountainous territories of the Central Pyrenees as a distinct political entity during the early 11th century when Ramiro I established royal authority over regions that had previously been governed as counties subordinate to Navarre. The kingdom's strategic location controlling Trans-Pyrenean routes provided opportunities for both military expansion and commercial development that enabled Aragonese rulers to compete effectively with their more powerful neighbors. The harsh mountain environment that characterized much of Aragonese territory created populations of skilled warriors and hardy farmers who could be mobilized for military campaigns while maintaining agricultural production necessary for economic survival. The union of Aragon with the county of Barcelona through the marriage of Petronilla of Aragon and Ramon Berenguer IV in 1137 AD created the Crown of Aragon, a composite monarchy that would become one of medieval Europe's most successful political entities. This union combined Aragonese military capabilities with Catalan commercial expertise and Mediterranean maritime traditions, creating a political system capable of expansion both within the Iberian Peninsula and throughout the Western Mediterranean. The federal structure that developed within the Crown of Aragon preserved regional autonomy while providing mechanisms for coordinated military and diplomatic action. The County of Portugal, initially established as a frontier territory within the Kingdom of Leon, gradually achieved independence through the military and political achievements of Henry of Burgundy and his descendants. The county's location along the Atlantic coast provided access to maritime trade networks while its extensive river valleys offered agricultural resources that could support growing populations and military forces. The reconquest of territories south of the Douro River provided opportunities for territorial expansion and the establishment of new settlements that strengthened Portuguese political and economic foundations. Alfonso Henriques, who became Count of Portugal in 1112 AD at the age of 3, would transform the county into an independent kingdom through decades of military campaigning against both Islamic forces and his Leonese overlords. His victory over a much larger Islamic army at the Battle of Arique in 1139 AD provided the military prestige necessary to proclaim himself king while demonstrating Portuguese military capabilities to potential allies and enemies. The recognition of Portuguese independence by the Pope in 1179 AD legitimized the new kingdom's political status while providing ecclesiastical support for continued territorial expansion. The military orders that emerged during the 12th century provided Christian kingdoms with professional military forces specifically dedicated to warfare against Islamic territories while serving broader religious and political objectives. The Order of Santiago, founded around 1170 AD, combined monastic religious observances with military training that created disciplined fighting forces capable of sustained campaigning in difficult frontier conditions. The order's members took vows of poverty, chastity and obedience while dedicating their lives to the expansion of Christian political authority and the protection of Christian populations in contested territories. The Order of Calatrava, established in 1158 AD, assumed responsibility for defending the strategic fortress town of Calatrava after Castilian forces proved unable to maintain adequate garrisons in this exposed frontier position. The order's military effectiveness demonstrated the advantages of combining religious motivation with professional military training, as knights who viewed warfare as religious duty proved more reliable than feudal levies or mercenary forces motivated primarily by material rewards. The extensive territories granted to military orders provided economic foundations for their military activities while creating autonomous regions within Christian kingdoms. The capture of Toledo in 1085 AD by Alfonso VI of Castile marked a watershed moment in Christian-Islamic relations that demonstrated the shifting balance of power between the two religious communities. The city's strategic location in the geographic center of the peninsula, combined with its symbolic importance as the former Visigothic capital, made its conquest a significant psychological victory for Christian forces while representing a devastating loss for Islamic political authority. The relatively peaceful surrender of the city reflected both the military weakness of the Taifa of Toledo and the pragmatic policies pursued by Alfonso VI toward conquered Islamic populations. The siege of Toledo lasted for several years as Castilian forces gradually tightened their control over the surrounding countryside while cutting off supply lines that connected the city with other Islamic territories. The systematic nature of this siege demonstrated the improved military capabilities that Christian kingdoms had developed through centuries of frontier warfare, including the ability to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods, and the engineering skills necessary for effective siege operations. The city's eventual surrender occurred through negotiation rather than assault, preserving much of its population and infrastructure while facilitating the transition to Christian political control. The terms of Toledo's surrender established precedents for Christian treatment of conquered Islamic populations that would influence subsequent reconquest campaigns throughout the peninsula. The Mudejar population, Muslims who remained in Christian territory while maintaining their religious beliefs and many cultural practices, received guarantees of religious freedom, property rights and legal autonomy that enabled them to continue their economic activities while contributing to Christian military and administrative objectives. These arrangements demonstrated the pragmatic policies that successful Christian rulers adopted toward Islamic populations, whose skills and knowledge were essential for effective territorial administration. The Almoravid intervention that began in 1086 AD represented a dramatic transformation in the military and political dynamics of Christian-Islamic conflict in the peninsula. The Almoravids, a Berber religious movement that had conquered much of North and West Africa during the preceding decades, possessed military capabilities and religious motivation that exceeded those available to the fragmented Taifa kingdoms. Their arrival in Al-Andalus at the invitation of Seville's ruler, Al-Mu'tamid, created new challenges for Christian expansion while temporarily reviving Islamic political authority throughout much of the peninsula. Yusuf ibn Tashfin, the Almoravid emir who led the North African intervention, brought with him military forces that combined traditional Berber tactics with innovations developed during decades of warfare in the Saharan and sub-Saharan regions. The Almoravid army included large numbers of camel-mounted warriors whose mobility and endurance exceeded those of Christian cavalry forces, while their infantry formations incorporated disciplined units of spearmen and archers who could maintain cohesion during extended engagements. The religious enthusiasm that motivated Almoravid forces provided psychological advantages that compensated for their unfamiliarity with Iberian geographic and climatic conditions. The Battle of Sagrajas, fought near Badajoz in October 1086 AD, demonstrated the military effectiveness of Almoravid forces while revealing the vulnerabilities that had developed within Christian military systems during decades of campaigning against fragmented Islamic opposition. Alfonso VI's army, which included contingents from throughout his kingdom along with French knights who had come to participate in what they viewed as crusading warfare, suffered a devastating defeat that eliminated much of Castile's military leadership and left Christian territories vulnerable to Islamic counterattacks. The battle unfolded over a single day of intensive fighting that showcased the tactical innovations employed by Almoravid forces and the limitations of traditional Christian military approaches. The Almoravid use of war drums and other psychological warfare techniques disrupted Christian cavalry charges while their disciplined infantry formations prevented the individual combat that favored heavily armored Christian knights. The arrival of fresh Almoravid reserves during the afternoon phase of the battle transformed what had been a closely contested engagement into a complete Christian rout that left thousands of casualties on the battlefield. The Almoravid conquest of the Taifa kingdoms proceeded systematically during the years following their military victory at Sagragas as Yusuf ibn Tashfin eliminated the political fragmentation that had weakened Islamic resistance to Christian expansion. The deposition of Taifa rulers, many of whom were accused of corruption and religious laxity, consolidated Islamic territories under unified military command while providing resources that could be concentrated against Christian targets. This political unification temporarily reversed the momentum of Christian expansion while demonstrating the continued vitality of Islamic military and religious traditions. The cultural impact of Almoravid rule proved more controversial than their military achievements, as their austere religious practices and suspicion of intellectual activities conflicted with the sophisticated court cultures that had developed in the Taifa kingdoms. The destruction or abandonment of libraries, the persecution of philosophers and scientists, and the imposition of rigid religious orthodoxy eliminated many of the cultural achievements that had distinguished Andalusi civilization during the preceding centuries. These policies alienated many Andalusi intellectuals and religious leaders while reducing the cultural attractions that had made Al-Andalus a center of learning and artistic production. The Almohad movement that emerged in North Africa during the early 12th century represented an even more radical transformation of Islamic political and religious authority than the earlier Almoravid intervention. The Almohads, whose name derived from their emphasis on the unity of God, developed theological and political doctrines that rejected many of the compromises and accommodations that had characterized earlier Islamic rule in both North Africa and Al-Andalus. Their conquest of Almoravid territories during the 1140s created a unified Islamic empire that extended from the Atlantic coast of Morocco to the borders of Egypt. Abd al-Mumin, the first Almohad caliph, established administrative and military systems that could effectively govern the vast territories under Almohad control while maintaining the religious purity that formed the foundation of the movement's political legitimacy. The Almohad emphasis on religious education and theological orthodoxy created networks of schools and mosques that promoted their distinctive interpretation of Islamic law and practice throughout their territories. These educational institutions served both religious and political functions, creating cadres of administrators and religious leaders who could implement Almohad policies while maintaining ideological consistency across diverse populations and geographic regions. The Almohad conquest of Al-Andalus, completed by 1173 AD, eliminated the remaining vestiges of Taifa political organization while creating unified Islamic resistance to continued Christian expansion. The new rulers invested heavily in fortification projects that strengthened defensive capabilities throughout Al-Andalus while constructing new military installations that could support large-scale campaigns against Christian territories. The Giralda Tower in Seville, originally constructed as the minaret for the city's main mosque, exemplified the architectural achievements of the Almohad period while serving practical functions as both a religious symbol and a military observation post. The military organization developed by the Almohads incorporated lessons learned from previous conflicts with Christian forces while adapting traditional North African military practices to Iberian conditions. The Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa in July 1212 AD shattered Almohad military power and marked the beginning of the end for Islamic political authority in the Iberian Peninsula. The massive Christian coalition assembled by Alfonso VIII of Castile, supported by forces from Aragon, Navarre and Leon, along with contingents of French crusaders and military orders, confronted the Almohad Caliph al-Nasir in the rugged terrain of the Sierra Morena Mountains. The battle's outcome would determine whether Islamic forces could maintain their defensive capabilities or whether Christian expansion would accelerate toward the completion of the Reconquista. The Almohad army that marched north from Seville represented the culmination of North African military organization and included veteran Berber infantry units, Andalusi cavalry and contingents from throughout the Almohad Empire extending to the borders of Egypt. Al-Nasir's forces numbered approximately 30,000 warriors, including the elite Almohad Guard units that had proven decisive in previous campaigns against both Christian and Islamic opponents. The caliph's decision to seek a decisive battle rather than pursue defensive strategies reflected confidence in Almohad military superiority and the belief that a major victory could reverse the momentum of Christian expansion. The Christian army assembled at Toledo included forces that represented the military evolution of the northern kingdoms over 2 centuries of frontier warfare. Castilian heavy cavalry, equipped with the latest developments in armor and weaponry, formed the core of Christian offensive capabilities, while contingents from the military orders provided disciplined professional soldiers whose religious motivation matched that of their Islamic opponents. The presence of crossbow units, siege engineers and supply trains demonstrated the logistical sophistication that Christian forces had developed through decades of sustained military campaigns. The battle commenced at dawn with Almohad forces occupying defensive positions on elevated terrain that provided natural advantages against Christian cavalry charges. The Almohad deployment placed Berber infantry in the center. Protected by wooden stakes and supported by archers whose composite bows could penetrate most contemporary armor at effective ranges. Andalusi cavalry units positioned on the flanks were tasked with disrupting Christian formations while avoiding direct confrontation with heavily armored opponents whose superior equipment provided decisive advantages in close combat. Alfonso VIII's tactical plan sought to exploit Christian advantages in heavy cavalry while neutralizing Almohad defensive preparations through coordinated attacks that would prevent effective mutual support between different enemy units. The initial Christian assault targeted the Almohad flanks where Castilian and Aragonese cavalry could utilize their superior armor and weapons against lighter Islamic forces. Simultaneously, infantry units from the military orders advanced against the center, accepting heavy casualties to maintain pressure that would prevent Almohad reserves from reinforcing threatened sectors. The decisive moment occurred during the afternoon when Christian forces penetrated the Almohad defensive line and captured the caliph's tent, causing panic throughout Islamic ranks as rumors spread that al-Nasir had been killed. The collapse of Almohad resistance became complete when their reserve units, seeing the apparent death of their leader, abandoned their positions and fled southward toward the safety of fortified cities. The Christian victory was so complete that organized Almohad resistance in Al-Andalus effectively ended, leaving individual cities and regions to organize their own defenses against continued Christian expansion. The aftermath of Las Navas de Tolosa revealed the extent of Almohad military collapse and created opportunities for Christian forces to advance rapidly into territories that had been under Islamic control for over 4 centuries. The capture of enormous quantities of military equipment, including siege engines, weapons, and armor, provided Christian armies with enhanced capabilities for future campaigns while eliminating resources that might have sustained Islamic resistance. More importantly, the psychological impact of the victory demonstrated to both Christian and Islamic populations that Almohad military power could be decisively defeated through coordinated Christian action. The systematic conquest of major Andalusi cities proceeded with remarkable speed as Christian forces encountered minimal organized resistance from populations demoralized by the Almohad collapse. Córdoba, the former capital of the Umayyad Caliphate and symbol of Islamic political authority in the peninsula, surrendered to Ferdinand III of Castile in June 1236 AD after a siege that lasted only 5 months. The city's fall eliminated the last pretense of unified Islamic resistance while providing Christian forces with a strategic base for operations against remaining Islamic territories in the Guadalquivir Valley. The conquest of Córdoba required careful planning and substantial resources as the city's massive defensive walls and strategic location on the Guadalquivir River provided natural advantages that could have sustained prolonged resistance under different circumstances. Ferdinand III's siege operations included the construction of fortified camps that surrounded the city while preventing supplies from reaching the defenders, combined with systematic attacks on specific wall sections that gradually weakened defensive capabilities. The siege's relatively brief duration reflected both the effectiveness of Christian military techniques and the demoralization of Córdoba's defenders following the Almohad defeat. The surrender terms negotiated for Córdoba established precedents that would govern Christian treatment of conquered Islamic populations throughout the remainder of the Reconquista. The Mudejar population received guarantees of religious freedom and property rights in exchange for acknowledging Christian political authority and paying tribute taxes that supported continued military operations. These arrangements enabled the preservation of Islamic communities while providing Christian rulers with the administrative expertise and economic resources necessary for effective territorial governance. Valencia's conquest in 1238 AD by James I of Aragon demonstrated the military capabilities that the Crown of Aragon had developed through its expansion along the Mediterranean coast and throughout the western Mediterranean islands. The siege of Valencia lasted for over a year as Aragonese forces systematically reduced the city's defensive capabilities while preventing relief expeditions from reaching the besieged population. James I's use of naval blockades combined with land-based siege operations created comprehensive isolation that made continued resistance impossible despite the city's formidable fortifications and determined defenders. The fall of Valencia provided the Crown of Aragon with control over one of Al-Andalus' most prosperous regions while demonstrating Aragonese capabilities for large-scale military operations that required coordination between land and naval forces. The city's agricultural hinterland with its sophisticated irrigation systems and intensive cultivation methods provided economic resources that could support continued expansion while supplying food for growing Christian populations. The preservation of Islamic agricultural techniques and the retention of Mudéjar farmers ensured continuity of production that benefited both conquerors and conquered populations. Seville's surrender in November 1248 AD to Ferdinand III marked the culmination of Castilian expansion into the heart of Al-Andalus and eliminated the last major Islamic stronghold capable of coordinating resistance against Christian forces. The siege of Seville required unprecedented logistical efforts as Castilian forces maintained their positions for over 15 months while constructing siege works that gradually reduced the city's defensive capabilities. The capture of Seville's port through coordinated land and naval operations prevented supplies from reaching the defenders while demonstrating Christian mastery of combined arms warfare. The conquest of Seville provided Castile with control over the Guadalquivir River Valley and access to Atlantic trade routes that connected the peninsula with North Africa and Northern Europe. The city's strategic importance extended beyond its immediate military value to encompass economic and political considerations that would influence Castilian policy for centuries. The preservation of Seville's commercial infrastructure and the continuation of trade relationships with Islamic territories demonstrated the pragmatic policies that successful Christian rulers pursued toward conquered populations whose cooperation was essential for effective governance. The systematic nature of Christian expansion during the decades following Las Navas de Tolosa reflected improved military organization and strategic planning that enabled sustained campaigns across vast territories. Christian kingdoms developed logistical capabilities that could support large armies operating far from their bases while maintaining siege operations that might continue for months or years. The construction of supply depots, the organization of transport systems, and the coordination of naval and land forces demonstrated military sophistication that exceeded anything achieved during earlier phases of the Reconquista. The consolidation of Christian authority in conquered territories required administrative innovations that could effectively govern diverse populations while extracting resources necessary for continued military operations. The repartimiento system, which distributed conquered lands among Christian settlers, military orders, and royal administrators, created new social structures that integrated territorial conquest with demographic colonization. These land grants provided incentives for Christian settlement while establishing loyal populations that could defend newly acquired territories against Islamic counterattacks. The survival of the Nasrid Kingdom of Granada after 1248 AD reflected both the strategic advantages provided by the kingdom's mountainous terrain and the pragmatic policies pursued by its rulers toward their Christian neighbors. Muhammad ibn Nasr, who established the dynasty in 1238 AD, recognized that outright resistance to Christian expansion was impossible given the military balance that had emerged following the Almohad collapse. Instead, he pursued policies of accommodation that acknowledged Castilian suzerainty while maintaining internal autonomy and Islamic religious identity. The tributary relationship established between Granada and Castile provided both kingdoms with advantages that encouraged the preservation of this arrangement for over 2 centuries. Granada's annual tribute payments supplied Castile with substantial revenues that could support military operations in other regions while eliminating the costs associated with conquest and occupation of difficult mountain territories. For Granada, the tribute system provided security against Christian conquest while enabling the kingdom to maintain its distinctive Islamic civilization and serve as a refuge for Muslims fleeing from Christian-controlled territories. The Alhambra Palace complex, constructed during the 13th and 14th centuries, represented the architectural and artistic culmination of Islamic civilization in the peninsula while symbolizing Granada's unique position as the last independent Islamic kingdom. The palace's sophisticated design integrated residential, administrative and ceremonial functions within a unified architectural program that demonstrated the continued vitality of Islamic artistic traditions. The intricate geometric decorations, innovative water features and carefully planned spatial relationships created environments of extraordinary beauty that rivaled the greatest achievements of Islamic architecture throughout the medieval world. The construction of the Alhambra required coordination between skilled craftsmen from throughout the Islamic world and local artisans who maintained traditional Andalusi techniques while incorporating new influences from North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean. The palace's decorative programs combined calligraphic inscriptions from the Quran with geometric patterns and stylized plant motifs that created visual environments of remarkable complexity and sophistication. The integration of these decorative elements with structural features including arches, columns and vaulted ceilings demonstrated mastery of architectural principles that had been developed over centuries of Islamic building experience. The Court of Lions, completed during the reign of Muhammad V in the late 14th century, exemplified the architectural innovations that characterized the final phase of Islamic rule in the peninsula. The courtyard's central fountain, supported by 12 marble lions and surrounded by an arcade of slender columns, created spatial effects that combined functionality with aesthetic beauty. The mathematical precision required for the courtyard's proportional relationships and the technical skill necessary for carving the decorative elements demonstrated the high level of craftsmanship that Granada's rulers could command despite their kingdom's limited territorial extent. The economic foundation of the Nasrid kingdom rested upon the agricultural productivity of the Vega of Granada and the commercial relationships that connected the kingdom with both Christian territories and North African Islamic states. The intensive cultivation methods developed in the fertile plains surrounding Granada produced agricultural surpluses that could support the kingdom's urban population while providing exports that generated revenue for tribute payments and military expenditures. The preservation and improvement of Islamic irrigation systems enabled sustained agricultural productivity that exceeded levels achieved in many Christian territories. Commercial relationships with Christian kingdoms provided Granada with access to European markets while supplying luxury goods and raw materials that were not available within the kingdom's limited territories. Granadan merchants established trading networks that extended throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, utilizing their knowledge of both Islamic and Christian commercial practices to serve as intermediaries between different cultural and economic systems. These commercial activities generated revenues that supported the kingdom's administrative and military requirements while maintaining living standards that attracted continued immigration from Christian territories. The cultural achievements of Nasrid Granada represented both the preservation of traditional Islamic learning and the development of new intellectual traditions adapted to the kingdom's unique circumstances. The scholarly institutions established in Granada attracted students and teachers from throughout the Islamic world while maintaining libraries and scriptoriums that preserved classical texts and produced new works of literature. Philosophy and science. The synthesis of different Islamic intellectual traditions with local Andalusi scholarship created distinctive cultural achievements that influenced both Islamic and Christian intellectual development. Ibn al-Khatib, the great Granadan polymath who served as vizier during the 14th century, exemplified the intellectual sophistication that characterized the final phase of Islamic rule in the peninsula. His historical works, literary compositions and scientific investigations demonstrated the continued vitality of Islamic scholarship while addressing the practical challenges faced by a small Islamic kingdom surrounded by expanding Christian territories. His diplomatic correspondence with Christian rulers revealed the complex negotiations required to maintain Granada's independence, while his medical treatises contributed to European understanding of epidemic diseases. The gradual weakening of Granada's defensive capabilities during the 15th century reflected both internal political divisions and the growing military superiority of the united Castilian and Aragonese forces following the marriage of Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon in 1469 AD. The dynastic union of the two largest Christian kingdoms created unprecedented resources for military campaigns while eliminating the political divisions that had previously enabled Granada to play Christian rivals against each other. The consolidation of Christian political authority throughout the peninsula except for Granada made the kingdom's continued independence increasingly difficult to maintain. Internal conflicts within the Nasrid dynasty during the late 15th century provided the Catholic monarchs with opportunities to intervene in Granada affairs while weakening the kingdom's ability to coordinate effective resistance. The civil war between different claimants to the Nasrid throne divided the kingdom's military resources while creating factions that sought Christian support for their political ambitions. These internal divisions eliminated the political unity that had enabled Granada to survive for over 2 centuries while providing Christian forces with allies who possessed intimate knowledge of the kingdom's defensive capabilities and strategic weaknesses. The final war against Granada began in 1482 AD with Christian attacks on frontier fortresses that gradually reduced the kingdom's territorial extent while demonstrating the overwhelming military superiority that the Catholic monarchs could bring to bear against Islamic resistance. The systematic nature of Christian operations, which included the construction of permanent fortifications to secure conquered territories and the use of artillery to reduce Islamic strongholds, revealed military capabilities that far exceeded anything available to Granadan defenders. The siege techniques employed by Christian forces incorporated the latest developments in military engineering while utilizing resources that reflected the economic strength of the United Christian Kingdoms. The Siege of Malaga in 1487 AD demonstrated the ruthless efficiency with which Christian forces pursued the final conquest of Islamic territories. The siege lasted for over 3 months as Christian artillery systematically destroyed the city's defensive walls while naval blockades prevented supplies from reaching the defenders. The city's eventual surrender occurred only after its population had been reduced to starvation, while the harsh terms imposed by the Catholic monarchs eliminated any possibility of continued Islamic resistance in the region. The enslavement of much of Malaga's population served as a warning to other Islamic cities about the consequences of prolonged resistance. The final siege of Granada began in April 1491 AD with the construction of a massive Christian camp that surrounded the city while preventing any possibility of relief or resupply. The Catholic monarchs' decision to maintain their entire court at the siege site demonstrated their commitment to completing the conquest regardless of the time and resources required. The construction of the temporary city of Santa Fe with its permanent buildings and sophisticated infrastructure revealed the logistical capabilities that enabled Christian forces to maintain large armies in the field for extended periods. The surrender negotiations that concluded the siege reflected both the hopelessness of Granada's military situation and the pragmatic policies that the Catholic monarchs initially pursued toward the conquered Islamic population. The capitulation agreement signed in November 1491 AD guaranteed religious freedom, property rights and legal autonomy for Granada's Muslim population while acknowledging Christian political sovereignty. These terms, similar to those negotiated during earlier Christian conquests, were intended to facilitate the transition to Christian rule while maintaining social stability and economic productivity. The formal surrender of Granada occurred on January 2, 1492 AD when Boabdil, the last Nasrid ruler, handed over the keys to the Alhambra to representatives of the Catholic monarchs. The ceremony, conducted with elaborate protocol that emphasized both Christian victory and Islamic dignity, marked the end of nearly 8 centuries of Islamic political authority in the Iberian Peninsula. The completion of the Reconquista represented not only a military achievement but also the culmination of a cultural and religious transformation that had reshaped the peninsula's civilization. The aftermath of Granada's conquest revealed the complex challenges involved in integrating the last Islamic territory into the expanding Spanish monarchy. The large Muslim population that remained in Granada posed unprecedented administrative and religious challenges for Christian authorities who had previously dealt with much smaller Mudéjar communities. The initial policies of tolerance and accommodation gradually gave way to more aggressive assimilation measures that reflected both religious concerns and practical considerations about maintaining political control over potentially rebellious populations. The year 1492 AD thus marked not only the completion of the Reconquista but also the beginning of a new phase in Iberian history that would see the peninsula's transformation into the center of a global empire. The resources freed by the end of frontier warfare combined with the administrative experience gained through centuries of territorial conquest and population management provided the foundation for Spanish expansion into the Atlantic world. The same year that witnessed the fall of Granada also saw Columbus's first voyage to the Americas. symbolizing the redirection of Iberian energies from internal conquest to global exploration and colonization. The completion of the Reconquista represented the final triumph of Christian political authority over the Islamic civilization that had dominated much of the peninsula since the 8th century. The transformation of Al-Andalus from a sophisticated Islamic society into Christian Spanish territories marked the end of one of medieval Europe's most remarkable cultural syntheses while creating the political unity that would enable Spain's emergence as a global power. The legacy of Islamic presence in Iberia preserved in architectural monuments, agricultural techniques, linguistic influences and cultural practices would continue to shape Spanish civilization long after the last Islamic kingdom had fallen to Christian conquest.